Hirasawa Kazuki was just a run-of-the-mill Japanese university student, until a creepy notice hit his hands and promised his total destruction 8 years from now, and it left him staring at the page, shaking, wondering if it was real. In this brand-new reality, he was just a kid, hands shaking hard as he stared at his reflection, desperate to understand how he wound up like this. Dark liquid splattered the ground under him, crushed lilies scattered everywhere, and a voice thundered, demanding to know how he planned to take responsibility for the tragedy that was unfolding. Right nearby, a woman dropped to her knees begging for mercy while a towering armored figure stood frozen in silence, watching as the young boy stayed trapped in another woman's grip. The woman holding the boy kept firing off heartfelt apologies, but then the blonde noblewoman erupted in fury, tore into her for nonsense, and screamed that she was nothing but an inferior wretch. As her hand settled on his head, the young boy, still shaking from everything that just happened, couldn't help thinking, is this whole thing some kind of game? His mind snapped back to a console game he'd played, Brave Hearts *, a classic fantasy RPG where Liner, the main hero, dives into a world-saving quest to stop a deadly plan meant to wipe everything out. Even with that 2D battle screen, the game still exploded with specials, magic, and skills, and the battle system stayed so thrilling it practically wouldn't let you quit. Even though it plays like a straight line, the game hooks you with gorgeous skills, non-stop character banter, and loads of secret dungeons plus surprise side events. He'd crushed the game so many times he could quote every line and predict every event in his sleep, but this time something felt horribly off, like the whole thing was a glitch, a mistake, an anomaly he couldn't explain, even with his addiction and all that inside knowledge. Servant Clara, wife Jessica, and Hayden, the Stokes family's heads, stood there with grim faces, and their expressions echoed that chilling, wrong atmosphere feeling perfectly. He fought to keep his mind from shattering what had happened right before this and why the game's characters were moving like they had a pulse of their own. Was any of this real at all? That creepy dread kept clawing at him as he stood in the grand room staring at Clara crumpled on the floor, and the instant he realized what happened, he couldn't stop regretting how he'd been thrown into this brutal mess so suddenly. He recognized it instantly. This wasn't just any scene, it was a brutal flashback. Clara, the heroine's mom, got executed by Harold, the Stokes family's oldest son. He started hunting for Harold, remembering how, in this moment, he was supposed to be swept into a desperate, worried embrace. He stared at Clara's lifeless body, then snapped his gaze back to Jessica, confusion and panic flashing across his face as the game's heartbreaking tragedy finally hit him. Jessica flashed a reassuring smile and told him everything would be fine, then insisted he didn't need to worry anymore, yet her words only crushed his shock and left him more baffled than ever. A sudden, razor-sharp blast tore through the room, slicing the tense silence wide open. Hayden, right beside his father, snapped with fierce resolve that he'd personally hunt down and purge that depraved life, while Colette watched helplessly as Hayden brushed off every plea as useless. Then, with panic in his voice, he finally shouted at his dad, begging him to wait. Hirasawa Kazuki froze as his body launched on its own, horror clawing at him when he saw his own hand lift and his voice, now sounding like something else, snap, "Let me execute her." Hayden and Colette stared as he then tossed out an even crueler idea for Claire's end: use her as a training dummy since he'd just picked up brand new magic. Then he flashed a sinister grin and taunted her like, "Isn't this the better end for you before you dirty the room with that inferior blood?" Meanwhile, Harold Stokes, young, reddish-brown hair blazing, stood next to an armored guard holding Clara captive, and with a cruel grin he ordered the guard to toss her straight into the dungeon, laughing like it was the funniest thing ever. He kept spitting out cruel words, calling Clara a filthy half-breed, sneering that she couldn't do a single job right even after they'd shown her sympathy. Jessica watched the whole scene with a stone-cold face, then nodded and declared Clara an inferior species, right before saying Clara would be perfect for Harold's magical experiments. Standing between them, still trapped under his own body's ruthless autopilot, he just let that cruel fate land on Clara. Inside, everything roiled, darkness swept over his eyes, and a quiet, despairing laugh slipped out of him. As he strode off, lost in thought, it finally hit him, no matter that he was way younger than the original protagonist, his true identity was unmistakable. He fixed his eyes, and right beside him, Harold Stokes' silhouette snapped into view, confirming the sickening truth. He wasn't just anyone, it was Harold Stokes, the heinous, arrogant, and utterly despised heartbreaker of Braveheart's *. This was Harold Stokes' fate. He was sealed to be wiped out by Justice himself, the final boss. He was utterly lost, staring at the weirdness like, was that all a dream, or did something evil really grab me? Because he was just some ordinary university kid and none of this made sense. He groaned, crushed by the weight of it all. Suddenly, sharp knocks ripped through the air at the door. Before he could even react, Harold Stokes's voice, now coming from him, snapped, "Enter." The moment the door swung open, a jolt hit him. His own voice had blurted out "enter" like he hadn't meant it at all. He never would have said it that casually. Then an older man, dressed to perfection, strode into the room, bowed with respect, and said, "Excuse me, Norman." He clocked the man instantly. Norman, the butler everyone in the game calls the conscience of the Stokes, and he knew Norman was steady, not Stokesborn, the moral compass in every brutal family crisis. Then Norman leaned in and asked if he was there for business, and he answered, "Yeah, I need to talk to Harold Sama about something." Butler kept his eyes on him a second longer, and you could see concern slip across his face. Norman kept his eyes on him, then snapped, "Are you sick?" And the moment he tried to stay in Harold's skin, he told Norman he'd come back later if that's what was going on. Even as panic clawed at his insides, he shoved Harold's words out like a shield. "No, no, this isn't a big deal. I'm really all right. I said I'm fine." But Norman's worried stare didn't budge for a second. Norman stayed locked in, clocking how Harold usually snapped his complaints out loud, but now every word felt sifted, like rage got filtered through concern. Norman even gritted his teeth at Harold's crude habit, realizing Harold's trying to look like he cares, even though he's not actually meaning it. Finally, Norman dropped the real reason he came. "All right, I'll make this quick, please. I'm begging you, ease up on the punishment crushing Clara." Those words slammed into his mind like lightning, and he realized his mouth had already spoken them earlier, word for word, all on its own. Clara the maid flashed back in his memory, and with it the brutal truth. Harold was running her life. He'd completely shoved her suffering aside while the shock of becoming Harold nearly crushed him. Now he had to ask himself, was it really fine to just wait when he knew he had to save her no matter how he could? He stared into the game's brutal story. Clara, the heroine, was doomed to get killed by Harold's magic, and her daughter Colette would be kicked out of Stokes' territory, while Liner would protect her once she finally reached the village. And that's when the fear hit him. If he saved Clara right now, he'd rip the timeline apart and maybe steal the one moment he desperately needed with Liner. His inner war raged on. If he truly held the power to rewrite history, he'd still claw his way to becoming Liner's comrade no matter what changed. But if he didn't, all that waited ahead was pure darkness. So he focused hard, executing Harold's moves with surgical care, making sure he wouldn't accidentally make things worse for how others saw him. His mind stayed locked in deep thought, brow creased hard, and the moment he tried to dodge Harold's brutality, he could throw the whole story off course, so far off he'd lose the chance to predict what comes next. Still, all he wanted was to slip past every single death flag before it could spell his own end. With a sudden burst of resolve, his eyes sharpened and he locked in on a plan, no messing with the general scenario, just steering the ending to a safe, acceptable direction. Norman, the butler, watched him like he already knew something was about to shift. He snapped his head toward Norman and demanded, "Clara-san, she really is the servant from before, right?" Then he blurted that he wanted to rescue her with all his heart but admitted he couldn't move freely, and he pushed Norman hard. "So you're telling me you really want me to act and save that woman?" Norman snapped into a startled gasp, totally thrown off by Harold's shocking words. Norman, still reeling from the shock, told him, "If you really want to save Clara, stop talking and move, then I'll hear your reasons after." But inside, Norman's gut dropped because he knew this plan would send his hate points soaring straight into the stratosphere. Later, in his room, he dropped onto his bed the moment Norman barged in and he couldn't hide his gratitude. Then the butler's timing set him off and he snapped, "Hurry up and get out." He exhaled a tired, frustrated sigh, like the weight of everything just crushed his face. He crumpled onto his bed in a messy sprawl and groaned that maybe, just maybe, he'd been way too reckless with his decision. He stared down a desperate gamble. If he died here, maybe he'd wake up back in his own world. But that hope got smothered fast by his relentless inner voice and the constant grind of trying, again and again, not to make Harold's already awful reputation even worse. But he shut that idea down fast, draping spread-out gold across the bed. Because if this plan meant dying in his real world too, then it was pointless, and the risk was so huge he wouldn't even dare consider it. Suddenly, he snapped upright, eyes blazing as he swept the room. Then he caught sight of the scattered books and scrolls, and you could almost feel Harold's studies staring back in silence. He leaned in and scrutinized everything, and when he spotted a few books written in Japanese, pure relief hit him. Then, tangled in the mess, he found an empty life potion bottle and a red marble, both flashing instantly like they came straight out of the game. While he sank into his chair among towering stacks of books, a shocking thought hit him hard. Was this world really Braveheart or just a copycat? His mission stayed clear. Get out of here by dodging Harold's nasty moves that the game had already decided and stick to the script as closely as he could. With fresh purpose surging through him, he shot up from the ground and declared that to dodge his looming death, the very first move was simple: dig into the original story he knew and tear apart the room for anything he could use. They soon reached a lone tower and the knight pointed at it like, "That's the dungeon." He told the boy there was only one prisoner inside, and the boy answered with a smug, perfect grin. Inside the dungeon, the boy snapped an order to another knight: stay on watch and stop anyone else from getting in, then marched up to a cell where a figure was sprawled asleep on a cot. As he pushed deeper into the dim corridor, he pressed his command into the knight. He needed to talk to the prisoner alone. He pushed deeper into the tight passage, eyes locked on the cell waiting at the end, where a woman in a maid's uniform sat perfectly still, like a quiet smile in the middle of something brutal. Right at the iron bars, he leaned in and asked straight up if she was Clara Meller. When the woman snapped her gaze to him, shock lit up her eyes. Clara jolted when his name was brought up, glanced away and muttered about that past, wondering if it had already caught up to them, until he snapped in, cutting her off, saying he was there for another reason and demanding she answer every question truthfully. Then he pressed her about her family and she broke the truth wide open: she only had one daughter. He pushed on, cornering the question and demanding her daughter's name. Clara breathed out, "Colette." He pressed on with the interrogation, demanding to know what happened to the rest of her family. Clara cracked and said she'd basically run off with her husband, cutting ties with everyone back home, and that he'd died of an illness 3 years ago. He replayed the clues in his head and suddenly realized it. Colette had no family left at all, just her mother, and that simple truth landed like a quiet, knowing punch. The interrogation kept rolling. He pushed harder, asking Colette's age and if she'd ever dabbled in magic or trained in martial arts. Clara, still trapped, snapped back that her daughter was 9 this year and had 0 abilities like that. He realized this matched the original story exactly, and that somehow he'd even cracked new details nobody had shown him in this part of events. And just like that, he knew it was a perfect result. With his goal crushed, he snapped that the interrogation was over and started to leave, when Clara burst out in panic, begging him to wait, and deep inside, he locked in that his plan was finally fully complete. She kept begging, warning that if she died, her daughter Colette would be left all alone, too young to make it on her own, and she pleaded with him to take Colette in and protect her. Tears rained down Clara's face as she choked out in anguish, swearing over and over that her child hadn't done a thing wrong, pleading in pure desperation. He slowly snapped his gaze around, stone-faced, while Clara kept pleading for his help. He stared down at her, sneering at how she looked and calling her foolish for letting herself get trapped by the meaningless fear he swore was nothing. Clara's eyes went wide and glassy with tears as she stared up at him, begging with her silence to understand what those brutal words really meant. The cell door slammed shut with a thunderous echo, and the dungeon corridor seemed to swallow the prisoner whole, like the dungeon had just sealed their fate. Harold sighed, and you could almost hear his voice tremble, because she'd been crushed with despair, and even after he tried to comfort her, he knew his best was all he could offer, and it hit him so hard he nearly broke down too. As he started backing away from the cell, a voice snapped his name: Harold Song. He spun around. Norman, his aide, was closing in with rolled documents tucked under one arm and a clipboard in hand, and Harold immediately demanded what was inside. Norman laid out the documents and showed a full, detailed map of Stokes' territory, plus the key intel about every settlement hiding inside and around it. Norman then voiced his worry, saying rescuing Clara would be a huge mess, and Harold leaned in from his seat, hanging on every word. 2 men sat face to face, hammering out every last detail of the Stokes' territory as their conversation raged on. Harold brushed off the trouble like it meant nothing to him, but Norman's face twisted as he warned that pulling this off would basically force them to hand over some laborers and taxpayers to other nobles. Norman stared at the mess and realized the safest move for Clara was to run to a place the Stokes family couldn't touch. Harold pointed at one spot on the map and declared Blosh Village as the Laner family's home, then leaned in and told Norman to name a town that could be perfect for their plants. He kept pressing, asking if anyone could really roam freely through the domains of other nobles, and Norman snapped back that there weren't special limits, unless you were a merchant or a noble himself, but warned that Clara would barely survive if she were dumped into some strange land with nothing to rely on. Then Harold dove into the consequences for the whole tale, staring at how everything would shift depending on whether that young man and woman ever got close, and he finally decided the odds of their meeting were best right there, in that chosen place. He kept breaking down the logistics. If they wanted to bring Clara's daughter, Colette, they'd have to snag one of their wagons and get a travel permit, and good luck with that because it was brutal to obtain. Norman listened with bated breath, hanging on every word Harold said, because deep down he'd always pictured Harold as someone who didn't care about stuff like this, kind of like his own parents, but the details Harold noticed told a totally different story. And now Norman couldn't stop asking himself, did Harold really know about Claire's daughter? Norman finally decided Harold probably did know. Once the shock faded, he watched the kid in action and realized Harold was thinking hard and caring deeply about everyone in his charge. Norman replayed Harold's earlier brag about using Clara as a magic guinea pig, and suddenly it clicked. Harold might have been setting a trap. He could have been trying to yank her away and lock her somewhere safe just to see what Norman would do after those taunts. Norman stared at Harold's shocking silence over the eviction of innocent citizens and finally understood the truth. This wasn't cold indifference at all, it was one clear mission: protect Clara. And once that clicked, it hit him that Harold had been doing everything from the very beginning to keep her safe. With that realization burning in his chest, Norman vowed to throw everything he had into the task ahead. Meanwhile, Hayden and his wife loomed in front of a sprawling grand estate, proudly elitist, obsessed with pure blood, snubbing anyone who wasn't a pure-blood noble like they weren't even people. Harold was back with Harold and Norman, and he grilled the whole idea, saying Clara couldn't make it if there wasn't a steady place for her to earn income, while Norman shot back that the cost of living there was even worse than Stokes' territory, then flipped the script. The town would be desperate for extra hands during the upcoming Harvest Festival. Norman thought through all the twists and turns, and hope flared back in his chest, because if Harold Sama is at the front, then this can absolutely happen. Norman stared at Harold and just knew if that kid kept going, he'd shake up the Stokes family for the better, like a real ray of hope was about to light up their future. The very next morning broke, flooding the endless, forest-choked wilderness with blazing light. He straightened up, eyes cast downward, and one shaky syllable slipped from his mouth as he zeroed in on his intent. He stumbled back from a roaring pillar of fire, shaken by how those wild flames could rise into a blazing column and turn evil to ash. He threw his arm out and a brutal wave of fire erupted as he screamed the spell, Flame Cram. He froze in disbelief, eyes wide with shock as the truth finally hit: he'd actually pulled off the spell. He stared at the burned-out ground, stunned that the wreckage was even worse than his old game memories had ever prepared him for, and in that crushing moment he realized just how huge his actions really were, then kicked his first, it's not that bad assumption straight off the board as dead wrong. Even with everything so serious, a jolt of adrenaline hit him, then he snapped himself back because chanting felt wildly embarrassing right now. He weighed how to make it look like he truly burned someone alive, pushing the fire hard enough to reduce everything to ashes, leaving the scorched ground believable enough to dodge suspicion. He let out a small sigh of relief, realizing the damage was exactly what he planned, and decided that watching a body burn down to nothing at the real event wouldn't be that strange, especially with the big, flashy fire show he was itching to pull off. Under the moon's glow, he clenched his fist, jaw tight with grim resolve. Clara wasn't just a picture on a screen anymore, and he swore his mission would not end in failure because he was going to strike that very night. Beneath a sky littered with stars, the mission finally kicked off. 3 free figures stood against those far-off mountains. A tall, dark-haired man, a light-haired woman, and a little child, barely more than shadows in the thin, fading light. Moments later, Colette, the light-haired woman, froze with shock as her little daughter came sprinting up, yelling, "Mom!" at the top of her lungs, while a knight nearby gripped the horse's reins, packed down with supplies. Colette knelt, flung her arms wide, and wrapped the little girl in a tight, fierce hug, while Harold, the dark-haired man in the distance, stared like he couldn't look away, his hand lifting as if he might step in or just silently accept what he was seeing. She clutched her daughter to her chest, whispering her name over and over while the little girl hid her face in her mom's shoulder, finally feeling safe in that tight, loving embrace. Harold kept staring, face like a locked door, while Colette clutched her daughter on the ground, still huddled close as the knight and his horse loomed behind them. Then he marched right up to the pair, raised 2 fingers in front of them and said, "I'm giving you 2 choices. First, you die here." Harold shot out his arm, pointed them off into the distance and slammed down his second option: leave this land behind and start fresh beyond Stokes' territory. He laid out the brutal truth of the second option: pick it and leave and you're locked out for good, forced to cut every bond you've built until this moment. Colette heard his ultimatum and the shock hit her like a punch, her heart sinking as she stared at that impossible choice. Colette, still shaken by that ultimatum, snapped the question: would Harold really let them go? Harold, standing right there beside Norman, just stared back. He snapped back that killing them would be way easier than letting them walk away, then pushed her to decide. Now. Colette went stone still, terror and resignation tangled all over her face. She choked out an apology and admitted that the hardship was brutal, yet she still craved to live beside her child. Harold scoffed, making her words feel oddly flat as Norman watched the whole exchange. Harold snapped his gaze to Colette and shouted her name, then strode right up, planted his hands on her shoulders and promised he was about to hand her something, while her little daughter just stared from afar. She snapped at it and agreed right away. Then Harold, clutching a tiny pendant, ordered her in a hard, no-nonsense voice to keep it pressed around her neck at all times and never, ever take it off, because that was the deal he'd set for her and her daughter to finally escape. He told her that if she ever met a man around the same age who wanted the pendant, she should hand it over, then make him swear he'd protect her. Colette stared at him, totally baffled by that weird request, while Harold kept a stern, nearly annoyed look on his face. Realizing how serious this was, Colette nodded and accepted the order. Then Harold snapped his fingers for his guards. "Get Colette and her daughter into the wagon, move out right now." He shot them a chilling warning. If this failed, they'd be erased from the world. And he pushed them to be extra careful because the whole operation depended on staying invisible to anyone watching from the outside. As Colette and her daughter got ready to roll out with the knights, she poured out her deepest thanks to Harold. Then Norman said it was time for them to go too because the cold was creeping in. Harold stood there by himself, eyes distant and burning, replaying everything that had just happened like it was still unfolding. He told Norman to turn back first, his voice leaving no room for argument, while Clara and Miller stood right there, watching every word. Then he replayed everything that just happened, especially the gratitude they kept tossing his way for a rescue he hadn't even given, so yeah, it left him staring at the whole thing like, what am I missing? His thoughts snapped back to the moment that kicked off all the chaos. He'd carelessly run into Clara while she was watering the flower bed, sent her crashing to the ground and left her muddy and defeated. He could only shake his head at how stupid it was, because it gave him nothing to feel proud of. At last he decided it was okay, Colette and her daughter could finally live in peace, and when that thought hit, his whole face changed as he geared up to move on. Meanwhile, Norman, sent away, trudged off with a crushing heaviness in his chest, thinking, did I really leave Harold when he needed me? Then he forced that thought down. He knew Harold would bounce back soon and Norman's hovering would just make things worse. So he clenched his resolve and decided it was finally time to carry out his last duty. Suddenly, Norman's lungs froze in shock when Harold stepped out of nowhere wearing a threat-filled grin, and Harold taunted his ugly mug while Norman's mind screamed about his own life, because he knew Harold wouldn't ever let him just die. Out of nowhere, Harold shot his hand forward and blasted Norman with a scorching magical attack, Flame Cram screaming that it was over. As the attack finally fizzled out, Harold let out a shaky breath, because once again his choices just snapped back into the original story like they were on rails. Relief hit him hard and fast, thank goodness he'd already sent Norman away. If anyone had caught him muttering to himself about Clara, they'd have branded him the biggest monster alive. Harold couldn't believe it. Norman just stood there, stuck in place and apologizing under his breath, and Harold froze, confused out of his mind, sure he'd ordered him to go back first, so he snapped, wondering if Norman even heard a word of his command. He practically roared at Norman to wipe every single thing he'd seen from his mind, swearing he'd take the secret to his grave without spilling a word for the rest of his life. Then Harold made it crystal clear. The only answer he'd accept was a hard single yes. Norman couldn't stop thinking about why Harold had to bury his weakness so fiercely. Then his mind flashed back to the kid he used to be. After a beat, he nodded to himself and confirmed yes. As younger Harold spun around and strode off, Norman stared after him, eyes full of deep thought. Norman's mind slammed into the past, replaying how Harold treated his real parents like trash, then pushed himself to be better than them. Yet back then, when he didn't have any real power, he dodged a straight fight and chose deception instead. And that's when Norman realized Harold must have been stuck in a lonely war with himself the whole time. He already knew what would happen if he snapped up friction with his parents or anyone on the estate, so he went for deception, lying to both his parents and the people around him. The younger boy trudged alone, trapped under the crushing weight of never being able to open up to anyone. How badly did it hurt, and how heavy was that pain to carry? Norman looked back on those memories and berated himself, because for 10 whole years he never once saw the real weight of Harold's feelings and he never tried to get close. He shook the thought off, no more sitting around and brooding over the life he lost, because Norman decided that even if it cost him the rest of his life, he'd make those 10 dead, boring years count. This resolve would hold until the day finally came when that innocent boy's heart stopped getting crushed by the fake shadow of evil. A battered wagon, yanked by 2 hard-pulling horses, rumbled across a dead, starlit wilderness, while a few riders scanned the dark, and inside a little kid slept like nothing could touch them. As the road kept chewing forward, Clara Ameler, who was steering the wagon, stayed wide awake, eyes locked somewhere far away while the little kid slept right beside her. Meanwhile, 2 knights were swapping stories about the orders they'd just been handed. One, a young guy with reddish-brown hair, said their mission made sense because they'd learned Harold's moves the day before, and the other snapped that Harold had rounded up horsemen and plain soldiers too, then drilled them all to keep dead silent about everything he'd done. He went on to say Harold had been busy since morning, packing a spare set of clothes, lining up the horses, and setting the wagon in place, while he chuckled to himself the whole time. Later, the 3 knights got their marching orders: reach Balash village, drop Clara with the locals, and then snag the wagon there with 1 soldier rolling it straight to lights. Harold barked out the orders, then made it crystal clear that the gold coins his father handed him would go straight to Clara as severance, and he threw down a permit too, saying it was for a blacksmith in Lights to forge her a sword. The knights shot him puzzled looks and questioned his move, because those gold coins were handed to him for that exact blade and the necessary lights, and if he gave them away now, he'd never get it. The herald snapped back in pure frustration like, "Are you seriously that clueless?" Then told them they could just grab a cheap sword and be done with it. Meanwhile on the road, Clara O'Meller stirred awake and shot a worried look at the sleeping child, as if she couldn't help checking. Before long, the young knight with reddish-brown hair grabbed Clara's attention and announced that Blosh village was finally on the horizon, meaning their brutal, long journey was coming to an end. She thanked the knight for worrying about her but told him she just wanted to soak in the view a little longer, while he pressed her, asking why she wouldn't rest yet, insisting they'd reach their destination long before the sun even finished climbing. Meanwhile, Harold watched their road unfolding and nodded like, "Yeah, I get that feeling." The wagon kept rolling, hauling Clara and Colette forward on sheer drive, sharpened and relentless like a blade pushing them on. Harold, a young boy, sat glued to his books by a bright sunlit window, calm as could be, right before the chaos finally burst in. Elsewhere, a voice boomed through a huge, empty hall, shaking with disbelief. "What? You burned her so completely there wasn't even a corpse left." This memory felt like it was from his younger days, standing right between his parents while his mom showered him with praise for his magic, and his dad declared him a truly superb, proud son. He shrugged off their wild praise with a dismissive ha-ha dash, then leaned in like, "Yeah, go ahead and suspect me a little," insisting it wasn't a big deal at all. Later, he stared out the window and finally admitted it: his rescue mission had worked and he'd saved them. But one nagging thought wouldn't quit. No matter what he did, the ache between him and his real parents was still there, like a space they never planned to close. Just as Harold sank into quiet thoughts, Zen burst into the room with a bright greeting, and before the joy could land, Harold snapped, telling him to shut the door and get out. Cold faces didn't shake Sin at all. He bluntly questioned why Harold was there, and even recalled that time years ago when Harold tagged along on the night of the final full moon, even though he'd been riding in a wagon. With a quill in hand, the herald snapped, cut him off mid-sentence and demanded silence, then warned him not to blurt out what happened today or he'd end up as monster feed. Zin froze at how intense the threat felt, and he quickly realized Harold wasn't really booting him out. Harold just grumbled, "Give me a break." As Harold kept working, Zen watched him like something was ticking in his head, brooding and thoughtful, realizing that even with Harold's harsh attitude, he looked genuinely worried for him, like he refused to care about their different social ranks. He kept his eyes on Harold, clutching a tiny bottle and staring into it like it held a secret. Harold even wondered if his drop was the most effective, what would happen if he actually used it. Harold pressed him about the plants he was growing. Was it bell tubers, Bruna, Grudo to eat, or Zen? And the guy looked nervous before snapping back, "You want to cut up my intestines and stuff them in with the flower pot, or do you just plan to feed me to it?" Harold shot back that Zin's breeding plan looked totally messy, and Zin calmly replied, "Some plants had been soaked in the potion water and others hadn't." He blurted out how shocked he was. He'd never heard of restorative medicines being used on crops before. Harold stepped in and explained that this life potion supercharged the plants, helping them grow stronger and pushing the harvest yield way higher. Harold clutched a tiny fruit in one hand and scissors in the other, then warned that plants getting the wrong water mix would wither before they ever grew fruit, because right now he was hunting the perfect ratio. Then Harold told Zen to eat the fruit, and Zen let out a shocked raw and confused, but Harold just barked the order again. Moments later, Zen fumbled hard and the fruit slipped right out of his hands and hit the floor. "Fruit," he groaned through clenched teeth, because it hit him in the worst way. He'd been the one who shoved his head into that mess without thinking, and now he was paying for it. After one bite, he blurted out in pure shock, the fruit was sweeter, way more jaw-droppingly delicious than it should have been, and he demanded to know exactly what it was. Harold watched him, and it was clear the experiment had nailed it, turning out better than anyone could have hoped. Harold realized his life potion farming didn't match the game's crafting system perfectly, but it had still skyrocketed, so he saw no reason to waste it. Norman had already laid out the truth about Stokes' self-run territory. It got hammered by natural disasters, crops kept failing, and taxes kept crushing people until resentment spilled everywhere. Harold knew he had to scrub away every disadvantage he could because he couldn't predict when that anger would finally explode. And worse, his mind kept drifting to what might happen to his own family. Once Harold's plan clicked, he got a clear nod of agreement, then ordered him to bring the upgraded fruit straight to the cooks and track everything. How it stacks up against regular fruit, whether people would actually buy it, and every single result from their taste tests. He leaned in with a grim face and fired off his last command, "Please, if anyone asks where you got those or whose orders you're following." Zen, his subordinate, flashed a confident grin and said, "I know, Harold-sama, this is all a secret, right?" "Right?" Zen spun to leave, saying he was off, and Harold just stared as he walked away, annoyance bubbling in his head. What a pain. He shot one last look with those shining eyes, still grinning, then slipped away from the doorway, leaving Harold to ponder behind. So what on earth has him this excited? Moments later, Harold bolted outside and focused hard, swinging a wooden sword as he drilled his form, then he snapped right side. He pushed through his brutal training and drove a massive sweeping strike down with pinpoint precision, shouting as the blade finished the cut. Gasping for breath, he finally let his mind catch up. Phew, yeah, I'm getting used to this, aren't I? Since I'm stuck in Harold's body for now, I gotta wonder, do his stats run pretty high? His mind drifted straight back to the original story's protagonist, a young guy with reddish-brown hair Harold secretly thought was a total scumbag at the core, yet couldn't deny was insanely strong in battle. Then Harold snapped into his own vision, jaw set and fully committed, telling himself he wasn't there yet. Still, if I keep pushing, I might actually get close to him. And if I train harder, I can build real power, sharpening my magic and my sword skills step by step. His inner world flared open. There was older Zen, a younger Zen, and a young woman, all squaring off against a shadowy enemy, and he finally got it. In this RPG hellscape, you don't dodge fights for long, especially with Harold around, so survival meant one thing: he'd have to clash with the protagonist party. Harold stared out at the endless horizon, jaw set with iron determination. Let's do this. A dead white winter wasteland sprawls ahead, bare trees clawing at the sky while thin patches of weeds cling to the cold earth, and the jagged ground screams nobody's tamed this place. The story cuts to a dark, tangled forest where towering, skeletal trees loom against a gloomy, cloud-choked sky, and the whole place feels like dread with teeth. From an open veranda, a peaceful traditional Japanese garden stretches out before you as soft cherry blossoms drift down like slow falling petals. Now, cherry blossoms burst into full view in a lush close-up, swirling around a traditional Japanese building as fresh petals drift down like they're dancing through the air. In this old-school setting, someone kneels on the tatami with perfect form, hands folded in their lap, then speaks up, recognizing the Stokes family's son. Erica, a young woman of the summaries line, sits there perfectly formal, face set, eyes burning with resolve, while her father kneels behind her, begging forgiveness, and she shuts him down cold. Guarding their people is her duty. A hand darts toward a teacup as a voice snaps the truth: this miasma won't stop and citizens are dropping sick. Then the story slams into a bleak wasteland where decay has already eaten 30% of the whole mountain. Erica's father lays it out for her: if the decay keeps chewing through their lands, they'll lose their forestry business and the Sumeragi family can't survive the way they're used to. Then his voice cracks with regret as he admits there's only one way out. They have to sacrifice Erica to get the money they need, and he apologizes to her with a heart full of guilt. Erica turns her back on her father as he keeps begging for forgiveness. Then another young woman shouts for her, but Erica snaps back that she's powerless and that panicking won't change a thing. Erica stands there by herself, staring ahead with iron resolve, fully knowing this sacrifice is the only thing she can offer to keep her people safe. The Stokes family's grand estate loomed over the skyline, standing tall like it owned the sky itself. Inside, Norman leaned over a stack of papers and tore through every document with a razor-sharp, locked-in stare. Then he slid a matching set of papers to Harold, and Harold grabbed them with a focused, nearly stern look. In a calmer room at last, Norman leaned in and told Harold that the papers were the exact copy of the revenue and expense statement Harold had written himself. Then Norman spat, "You wretch." Harold stayed silent and looked the other way, so Norman pushed harder, grilling him for any big mistakes in the statement. Then Norman answered his own question and shut it down: there were none. Harold finally spun around, a sly smirk tugging at his lips, telling Norman to calm down. He hadn't come to stir up trouble, it was nothing like that. Then he finally dropped the real reason for the meeting: because the Stokes family's finances had been bleeding red ink for years. Norman admitted they were stuffing the gaps with family inheritances and getting crushed by heavy taxes, but he knew it couldn't go on, only tightening the noose around everyone's life. Then Harold snapped back, saying the real reason they were drowning was his parents' non-stop extravagance, all for show, and the wild display of it: chess sets, fancy wines, and mountains of coins proved every word. Harold whipped his eyes to Norman and challenged him straight up, asking if he really disagreed with that opinion. Norman, staring down a brutal money crisis, admitted that this ugly trend was absolutely real. As Harold kept going, he laid out how immigrants from the Stokes territory were piling in, and how brutal money troubles had driven countless people to shut down their farms for good. He nailed his point with a simple, rock-solid "yeah." Harold snapped that this was an emergency, saying the Stokes family would fall apart for good if nothing changed, then quickly dialed it back, making it sound like things weren't as hopeless as his first words suggested. Norman warned him to shut his mouth about it, scared someone might overhear and twist it into proof he wanted to rebel. Harold just laughed, thinking it'd be awesome if the Stokes family started falling apart. He laid out a grim vision: bankruptcy creeping in, especially in farming, if their returns didn't spike, then brushed off the people's worries with a cold, dismissive snap. Norman, already sitting down, stared Harold in the eye and said, "I'm an agriculture inspector," then made it clear he'd called on them on purpose. Suddenly, Zen burst into the room, grinning and yelling, "Yep yep," bowl in hand, and Norman just stared, completely thrown, asking what on earth he was doing. Norman's eyes popped wide when Zen swept in a basket stacked with what looked exactly like red Groot. Zen practically barked at Norman to stay silent, telling him to just enjoy Harold's handmade red grout, only for Norman, totally stunned, to blurt out what those things even were. Zen, still choking on an apology, squared up with Harold Sterngace, arms crossed. Harold growled that if Zen really meant to turn down the offer, he'd better think twice because he'd end up as fertilizer. Norman watched from the side, catching every tense word. Norman gripped the basket and stared at the red Groot inside, wondering if Harold really sent it. He grabbed one of the red Groot pieces, bit down hard, and his eyes shot wide. He burst out, shocked by how sweet it tasted. Meanwhile, Harold slouched in his seat with arms crossed and pure annoyance blazing across his face, while Zen beside him grinned like he'd just won, so Harold snapped, asking what on earth he had to be so proud of. Harold then burst out that the red Groot was something he'd cultivated with a secret technique, then he snapped the conversation to something else. He snapped his head toward Norman, who sat across from him, and demanded his help right then. Norman stared at Harold, stunned, and demanded to know why he was being pulled into this. Harold said Norman could take the job because he already knew the Stokes family's money and land, and he warned that if the situation demanded special gear, it would cost a pretty penny to get it done. He pressed on, asking if Norman could figure out whether that gear could be installed and nail down the exact costs too. Then Norman just went quiet, staring at the basket of red Groot. Terrell said Norman probably wouldn't give a real answer until he heard the whole story, and Norman shot back that if there was any way to make their situation better, he'd help with everything he had. He leaned in, smirking like he already knew, and Harold warned him that pulling off something like that would surely set his father off, then it'd end with prison bars and a dungeon waiting. Norman weighed the consequences and finally admitted it. Of course that would happen naturally, while Zen beside him flashed a tiny, knowing smile. Harold snapped at Zin to use his head, calling him an idiot, and Zin shot back that if Harold kept shrugging it off, then Harold would just become another headache piling onto his shoulders. Harold snapped his focus to Clara and raised a tiny, ornate key like it was a secret weapon, saying it was the key to the whole story and that he'd reveal everything she wanted. Clara stayed silent by the window, just watching. He kicked off a bold new farming idea he dubbed the LP farming method, where he dosed the crops with life potions to supercharge their growth. Harold snapped that this system existed to shield their money if the plan blew up, then he vowed to teach the technique to a handful of farmers and trial it in tiny patches first. He kept going, saying even if the LP farming plan paid off, they'd still push hard to shrink the gap between farmers, run it on a small scale, and if it ever failed and someone got crushed by it, they'd step in with help for any farmer who couldn't spare the land. And best of all, the Stokes family's huge stash of life potions would be enough to keep those combined farms running. Harold pointed at a crate packed with tiny bottles, and when the lid came up, it was clear most of them were already past their prime and ready to be thrown out, so there'd be no upfront cost for the potions at all. He drove the point home. The LP farming method's biggest power was its insanely fast growth rate, and yeah, the crop size and taste could swing based on how much life potion you poured in and what you were growing, but the cultivation speed. That part never lied. Take a red Groot, normally it needs about 2 months to reach harvest, but with the LP farming method it can ripen and bear fruit in just 5 to 7 days. He kept pushing his explanation, admitting that if LP farming turned out to flood the market with cheap, top-tier goods, it could wreck prices and hurt farmers outside Stokes' territory. Then Norman's jaw dropped as he demanded to know how anyone could pull off a real harvest in just 5 days, while Clara worried that growth that fast couldn't end well. He couldn't stop fretting about his own safety, convinced he had a target on his back, because if anyone found out he was the inventor behind the LP farming method, he just knew they'd resent him for it. Then he said it plain, his father, a money-hungry brute, would try to choke the life out of the LP farming method the second he got wind of it. Harold admitted his first plan was to build a specialized team from scratch, but now he swore they should start small, with hard limits on exactly how much they pull from the farms. Norman and Clara stayed quiet, staring like his words just hit them in the chest, and when Harold clocked their faces he snapped if they really liked throwing him that fool look. Then he pressed on, saying that once they slowly built up more economic freedom, they'd finally be able to try other crops too. Norman shot out an apology, totally stunned by how deep Harold's plans went, even though he'd already caught bits and pieces before, and he couldn't help but admire Harold's ruthless attention to detail. Then Clara hurried in with her own apology, clapping a hand over her mouth as she spoke. Harold stared in shock, then blurted, "Your praise worries me," because he could already feel how amateur his own thinking was, and he snapped, "I only laid out the framework. I want you to fill in the details." Then his voice went sharp. "I don't need a yes man. If something feels off, tell me everything, no hiding it." They both nodded and snapped back, proving they'd caught every word. Lara tugged her glasses back into place and sized up Harold's soul, his wildly groundbreaking cultivation method, the sharp brains behind his practical policies, and that ruthless ambition that never spared him a moment, not even once. Norman turned his eyes to Harold and clocked it instantly. Harold didn't chase a single coin or shred of honor. He was laser-focused on helping the people, driven by raw compassion that ran deep. He decided Harold really had what it takes to lead. Then Norman stepped in and pushed one last question: would he be his arms and legs? Harold stood there, arms crossed, staring back with pure, unshakable determination. Clara O'Meller pressed a hand to her chest and swore she'd never waver. She'd pour every last drop of strength into Harold. Meanwhile, Harold clung to a brutally cynical view of the world. He sneered at the idea that anyone would use real strength for anyone but themselves, calling the whole crowd a bunch of weaklings, and insisting that if they didn't follow his plan, they wouldn't stand a chance. The Stokes family's grand manor loomed in all its glory, roaring with pride for generations that refused to die. Inside, Harold's father leaned in and told him, straight to his face, that someone had already been picked for his marriage. At the family table, Harold's mother lit up and praised the plan as magnificent, while his father claimed marrying into the Summaries family would beef up the Stokes bloodline. Yet Harold, still stunned by the news, couldn't stop asking who exactly his partner would be. His father kept going, saying the Summaries family wanted an audience and that in just 2 or 3 days they'd be heading straight into Summaries territory. Harold nodded, but something flickered inside him. That faint buried memory of a fiancé. Harold Muse sensed the Summaries family hesitated at the very idea of the deal, because they were a storied noble house that helped forge the nation, stayed tightly bound to the monarchy, and any alliance with them would shoot the Stokes family's pureblood doctrine and prestige even higher. Meanwhile, Harold's father laid it all out. The Summaries family was forced to give away their precious daughter just to keep their finances afloat, tossing her into a world that would only call someone human if they were noble. Harold heard the details and boom, felt it click. Summaries territory is getting hit by miasma damage right now. His stomach sank at the worst possible time because he just handed Norman and Jake the job of preparing the LP farming method, praying for one quiet break before the next engagement talk. A sly, knowing smirk crept across Harold's face as his mind raced with the implications. That quiet study, packed wall to wall with books, gave him just enough peace to breathe before the day's revelations hit again. He tore through his book word by word, mumbling plant names like he was calling out real weed, anise hyssop, katan fong, then stopped cold, trying to remember what else he still needed. Meanwhile, Norman lounged on the bed like he had all the time in the world, while Harold sat in a totally different room, buried in his studies at a huge formal desk. As he kept reading, Harold's mind kept slipping to Tasuku Sumairji, the head of the Sumairji family, someone he knew was kind, sharp, and deeply connected, yet trapped by the Stokes family's constant watch, meaning he couldn't move freely even if he wanted to steer clear of more trouble. Harold turned his thoughts to the protagonist, Liner, picturing him armored and ready. Then he realized that if he could win Liner over, he'd have a way smoother time backing him and everyone else from the shadows. While Harold weighed these risky alliances, he decided that getting Tasuku on his side was worth it, even if that could twist things away from the original story. Just as he was locking in his plan, Norman cut in and asked whether Harold was cooking up yet another farming scheme, pointing out that all this talk gave them a chance to reach the Summaries family. Harold snapped back hard, saying it had nothing to do with him, then demanded to know why Norman was even there, especially on his holiday. Harold snapped, swung a hard blow to drive Norman out of the room, and demanded to know why he was there. Wasn't it Norman's holiday? After that interruption, Harold fell back into his groove, sleeping, hitting the outdoors for serious physical work, then locking in at his desk and writing without stopping. He labored with razor precision, pinning every thought to the page with a quill, while scattered, crumpled sheets proved just how many times he revised and how hard he pushed. Later, while he finally caught his breath, Norman's voice snapped through the air, telling him the estate was right there ahead. He leaned out of the carriage window, soaking in the blur of the world as a solid wall and a calm river slid past. He leaned out from behind the Samurai Jai estate's old stone walls, and a warm lantern glow caught his face, like the place itself just announced, "He's here." A Summarais servant greeted him with a warm smile and ushered him into the estate, but then they ordered him to yank off his shoes and slip into strange slippers, something that already felt off, until he noticed the pair they handed him definitely wasn't his. The servant clocked his hesitation and snapped back instantly with the right slippers, sliding them into place so he'd be comfortable in the old house. He stepped inside and clocked the Summaries family right away, especially Erika Summaries, the daughter known as Liner's comrade, with her eyes drifting off like she was deep in thought. He couldn't stop replaying how Erica's heart was so tender she even gave kindness to monsters, and how once she'd hated him with everything in her. Still, he knew her duty to the Stokes kept her tied to him no matter what she felt. That's why he realized there was only one person he could never approach carelessly: Erica. He wrestled with the wild idea that Erica's crushing kindness could finally sharpen into judgment and common sense. Then she'd actually agree to an engagement with a herald who's stepped off the road of evil. He told himself, if her kindness keeps her from becoming a comrade of the protagonist's liner, I can't let that happen. But if that was the only problem, then maybe, just maybe, he could still handle it. Erica, this precious healer, was their lifeline, and without her, every conquest would instantly get way harder. He stared down that grim reality. Sure, he might dodge every death flag in his own path, but if Liner couldn't take down the final boss and the world got wiped out anyway, then all of it would mean absolutely nothing. He felt his conscience crushing him, but he knew he couldn't say any of that out loud, because the only way his plans could move forward was keeping Erica's opinion of him locked in as solid and positive as possible. He shot his hand out in a polite greeting, all while thinking, this is the first time I'm meeting you. Tasuku Sumaerji, the head of the Sumaerji family, stepped up and flashed a warm smile like he was greeting an old friend. Then he brought Erica into the spotlight, and right beside her stood his wife, Kiyomi. Harold was stunned. Somehow he could keep his tone respectful, and he stepped up to the family, formally introducing himself with a bright, genuine grin like, I'm truly happy to meet you all. His father, always playing the matchmaker, leaned toward Erica and asked what she thought of Harold, even saying he was pretty handsome. Erica gave a small, knowing smile and agreed, yes, Harold was very handsome. Harold cracked a strained laugh because even with all that politeness spilling from Erica's mouth, her eyes looked dead inside, something the game never once warned him about. Suku just kept thinking of the best way to handle things, while Kiyomi, his wife, urged him to leave Erica and Harold alone so they could finally open their hearts to each other. Harold's father lit up and said yes, this was a splendid idea, and Tasuku nodded along, calling it a smart move, while Harold realized this was the kind of crucial opportunity you don't get twice. Kiyomi then told Erica to take Harold on a tour and made her promise to come back when it was time to eat, and Erica just nodded, quiet, steady, and ready to do it. With the tour set, Erica spun around and told Harold, polite as ever, to follow close behind as she led the way. Harold Stokes stood there as the private tour loomed, thanked Erica with perfect politeness, and said it was truly an honor to have her as his escort, but under that calm smile, steel-hot determination burned. In his head, he tightened his grip and reminded himself this was the make-or-break moment. His whole plan would either survive or shatter. Harold Stokes, still a young kid, hurried side by side with Erica Saimragi as they closed in on a traditional Japanese estate. Right when they hit the stone path, Erica froze, her traditional sandals pressing into the cracked ground as she weighed her next move. Then she swung around to face Harold, and there they stood beneath a massive, ancient cherry blossom tree, its branches clawing for the sky, while her thoughts kicked back in again. Erica marched up and formally introduced herself. She hit him with her full name and made it crystal clear she was Tasuku Sumaerji's daughter. Harold Stokes stepped forward, introduced himself, and stared at her from afar with a face that gave nothing away. Erica then leaned in and said, look, this tree is a cherry blossom, the exact flower that stands for the Sumaerji family. She traced its roots back more than 500 years, when a feudal lord brought the seedlings with him as he arrived, and now those very plants stand as the official symbol of Samurai Jai. Harold grilled her about cherry blossoms, scoffing that they didn't match the ones he knew, then shrugged it off, saying he didn't care at all, like it was probably just a lookalike. Aharaka, thrown off by that cold indifference, stared him down and demanded, so you're not interested in the Sumaerji family, is that what you mean? With a sly little smirk, Harold told her to take his words however she wanted, while he quietly noticed how Erica always dodged the real point, like she was allergic to it. Then he wondered if he'd be better off if she just hated him, even considering cranking up the vulgarity to make it happen. But when Erica heard his dismissive tone, she decided that all he wanted was the Samurai Jai name, only for a sudden flicker of doubt to hit her, like maybe she'd misunderstood. He kept firing off those provocative remarks, claiming he couldn't picture the Stokes name being less than, and swearing the powerful Sumaerages would never stoop so low as to come begging them for help. Erica shot back a frustrated grimace, pure anger flashing across her face, and Harold clocked it instantly. Maybe he'd been pushing too hard and his whole original plan could blow up if he kept insulting her. She shoved an envelope into her hands and told her, "Give this to my father when we get back." Erica frowned, suspicious of what was inside, and refused to take it until Harold's voice turned icy and he warned her, "If you want those suffering people to die, go ahead." "Refuse," she demanded. "Are you saying there's a way to save my people from this mess?" And he nodded, insisting it might still be possible because really she had nothing to lose. Then they stood together by the dead cherry blossom tree, and the truth of that question hung in the air like a blade. Harold thrust the envelope toward her, and Erica's face still twisted with doubt as she slowly stretched out her hand to take it. When she finally snatched the envelope, Harold told her flat out she didn't have to trust him blindly, she'd decide after she saw the results. Erica stayed on edge and couldn't fully believe him, but the need in her voice was undeniable. Harold finally made it back to his own place and Norman welcomed him like an old friend, telling him he must be exhausted from the road and should rest, but Harold didn't even sit down. He demanded a full update on how the LP farming method was going. Norman told Harold they could kick off the trials in just 10 days, and the best part was they secured solid fields without a single hiccup, plus they'd already walked their farmers through the whole method. So Harold leaned in, hanging on every word like it mattered. Norman nodded, promising he'd keep following Jake's every instruction, and Harold only gave a quiet approval in return. Harold sat there in silence, feeling everything clicking into place behind the curtain, and best of all, he sensed his parents weren't even close to catching on to his secret little scheme. He figured it was safe to keep an eye on the Sumeragi family for now, trusting Erica, who genuinely cared about her people, to seize any shot to rescue them from the miasma, and he was sure she'd deliver that letter to Tsukuhu even if the contents were a little ridiculous since they'd been guessed from a dungeon map. His thoughts kept screaming one thing: this mess would force Erica to step in as the protagonist's ally, and she'd have to fix it herself. He figured if that letter didn't snap Tasuku's mind into place, then he'd have to corner him another way and hit him with the antibiotics exactly like he'd planned. Sure, Erica already grabbed the letter, but that wouldn't fix the real problem. A few days later, the protagonist, Liner, exploded with rage and confronted his companions, barking that he wanted answers. What were they even doing, and did they really want to keep training? With tears brimming, his male companions snapped that they couldn't be the only ones in for a brutal time, while the Liner roared at them to step up ready to die or else face the suffering anyway. And he demanded, "So tell me, do you want to meet my sword for real?" Liner, seething, muttered that his companions were in a miserable state, and it hit him that asking a soldier to teach was a bad call because nobody was even pressuring him with full force, even though he craved real combat techniques. And then he couldn't help but wonder how they could call themselves soldiers if they crumbled in fear against some green newbie. Meanwhile, Harold wrestled with the idea of asking his father for a serious teacher, but he shut it down fast because he couldn't picture his lovable old man hiring someone like that. Right then, a servant came up to him. The servant walked in and told Harold a guest had arrived, and Harold froze, scratching his head like who would even dare show up. Then the servant finally spoke the name, Erica Samaragi. Harold stared in stunned disbelief at Erica Samaragi's sudden, unexpected appearance. Harold Stokes, jaw clenched with pure rage, snapped at Erica Sumeragi for showing up out of nowhere, especially right before the LP method farming trials kicked off, demanding to know why she was there and not just a messenger. Inside, he wrestled with the thought that the Sumeragi family must have sent her on purpose, maybe to answer the letter he'd written. Meanwhile, Erica sat there like nothing could touch her, calm as a painting, teacup to her lips, that serene smile daring Harold to read her thoughts. When a servant offered her more tea, she accepted it with effortless grace. Moments later, Harold stepped right up to her and demanded to know why she was there. Then he snapped at her, saying her first response wasn't supposed to be an apology for making him wait, but a clear explanation for why she was even there. Erica hung her head and admitted she'd shown up way too suddenly, but he snapped her words in half, claiming he had zero free time and she should be grateful he even bothered to show up. He let out an exasperated sigh, crossed his arms, and gave in to the mess. Then he snapped at her to say her purpose and do it fast. Erica bowed so deeply it looked like she'd disappear, then threw the Sumeragi family's gratitude right into the room, saying they'd saved countless citizens and meant every word. Harold's mind clicked instantly. Tasaku had moved fast, cooked up those antibiotics, and they'd worked, saving lives when it mattered most. She nodded and made it clear Sumeraga's had 0 moves left. He smirked like he'd just seen a trap snap shut because the Sumeragi family was getting cornered hard, especially when your business was bootleg stuff. He then told her straight up that his idea was just a stopgap fix, not the real solution, and warned her about possible side effects, then made it clear she shouldn't confuse his kindness for free help because he'd expect plenty in return. He kept going, saying the medicine might help people with mild symptoms, but for the truly sick, it wouldn't do a thing, and he wasn't planning to protect her folk any further than that. Erica heard the hard truth and nodded, knowing his cure wouldn't fully fix them. She stared at what just happened and couldn't shake the shock, because that engagement was supposed to be nothing but politics, a way for the Stokes family to protect their honor, and yet Harold still went out of his way to deliver medicine. The Sumeragi family's own deep investigations couldn't pull off the same miracle. So she kept asking herself, when did he even manage to develop it, had it been after the engagement? And how in the span of just days did he pull that off? With a hard stare, he demanded to know if she'd come only to thank him. She jumped back in shock, but when she saw there was more, she shoved a letter into his hands addressed to Suku Sumeragi, and Harold snatched it up fast. Erica's stomach dropped as the truth hit. She hadn't come here for nothing, she'd been sent as the messenger. Then the letter started. Dear Harold Cohen, if you're reading this letter, Erica should have told you about the antibiotics you instructed me about. The letter kept going, and Suku Sumeragi poured out deep gratitude to Harold for helping their people, saying it'd be downright unforgivable to leave thanks trapped in ink alone. Then his wife Kiyomi and even a servant stepped in, echoing his exact words. He kept reading, then caught the report that this remedy hadn't caused a single side effect yet, but anyone who used it for too long or took big doses would have to be watched like a hawk. Harold stared at the page, stunned at how fast the medicine seemed to kick in. His hand clutched the letter and he couldn't shake the feeling, what if the message hid more than what he'd already read? Then the letter swerved into a postscript. Tasuku admitted Harold had finally clocked how desperate things were in Sumeragi territory, how suffocating the pressure had become, and he even warned that this sudden, unprecedented move could unleash trouble nobody saw coming. It ends with Tasuku cracking a grin, saying it may be painful for him, but he's got a request to make. Harold scanned the last lines, and then Tasuku, playing the worried father, basically admitted he'd probably never belong pulling personal feelings into this, yet he begged Harold to watch over Erica for now at the Stokes estate. Harold's eyes snapped wide at the wild, unexpected request. Erica stood nearby, brow tense, locked on her father's words. What did they even mean? Even with their engagement, she couldn't shake the thought that sharing a roof would just throw Harold's life out of place, and when she glanced back, Harold was wearing that same worry on his face. She knew her coach was back already, so it all came down to Harold's kindness, and Harold just smirked, praising her nerve while calling her a bitch and demanding to know what she wanted. Rage exploded out of him as he blamed her for being cold-hearted, spitting in the face of her own people, and he flat-out refused her one-sided demand, saying it wasn't honorable at all and that the pay he was promised felt completely underwhelming. While rage simmered in his chest, she calmly asked if he really meant to walk away, asking for nothing more than what they'd already agreed on, and it left him frozen. Then she snapped that she needed nothing else, flashed out of the room at unbelievable speed, and left him standing there, totally stunned as he shouted after her. Alone, he stared out at the distant horizon, and unease crawled in like a shadow right up until he admitted to himself, "Yeah, I've got a horrible feeling about all of this." Meanwhile, a Stokes family coach bounced over the cobblestones as the servant inside muttered that something felt terribly wrong since morning, totally clueless that shocking news was about to slam into their lives. Inside the bouncing carriage, Harold looked furious as he snapped at his servant to shut up and stop saying things out loud, because if anyone overheard, they'd be in deep trouble. A few hours after Erica vanished from the Stokes house, a message from Taisuke slammed into the scene, and when Harold's father read it out, he made the announcement that Lady Erica would be staying with them for good. Harold's dad flashed a cheerful grin and told him there was zero reason to feel ashamed. Both families had already accepted their relationship. Then Harold snapped back, curt as a blade, saying he wanted nothing, absolutely nothing, to do with living with her. Harold's protests didn't stop him. His father barked that he had to go and grab her, because she was due to roll up at the eastern gate of their territory early the very next morning. He felt it in his bones, pure dread crawled over him like some warning screamed, "Something's wrong." Then he couldn't shake the question, how could Erica show up only a day after the notice reached Hayden when even a desperate trip should take a full week? He figured her sudden arrival wasn't an accident, it felt like she'd been planning to stay all along, which begged the question, what was her real motive? Meanwhile, Erica planted herself with a steely look, eyes fixed on the wavering scene. He realized this crazy twist probably wasn't in the original story at all, and he knew deep down the whole disaster was his fault, coming straight from that letter he wrote. Then it hit him like a punch. He was finally walking into the consequences of everything he planted. When he neared the carriage, he spotted Erica, but just beside her, a second young woman stood there too, lugging suitcases like it was no big deal, and he froze, questions screaming to break out. His eyes narrowed the second Erica told him it was an honor for him to pick her up himself. He inwardly sneered because he knew that wasn't the real vibe. Then, like the question burst out of him, he asked who the other young woman was. With a dazzling smile, she introduced herself as Erica's attendant and immediately told her she'd handle every daily necessity while they were staying there. He clicked his tongue in irritation. Erica was already enough of a nightmare, and now a samurai Jai family attendant showed up with her, a total wildcard who never even existed in the original story, making his life spiral out of control. He told them both, clear as day, that he had zero time for babysitting. If they couldn't get away, he'd just tune them out and let it all slide, making it brutally obvious he didn't care one bit about Erica's weird little connection, especially with this total mystery shadow tagging along behind her. With that, he spun around and strode off, telling them they could stay, but if they got in his way, he'd make them regret it. He shot one last, exasperated look over his shoulder, silently demanding why they couldn't just head home if they really understood a word he said, yet Erica, calm as ever, only met his message with gentle, knowing expressions. Harold's stomach dropped as his father, with a huge flourish, proudly declared that Lady Erica Sumergi, the son's fiancée, had finally arrived, along with her attendant Yanadono, and then demanded everyone stare up close at the honored guests. Then he spun toward Harold with a grin, basically saying, "Yeah, we're all here," and announced that Erica and Yuno were sticking around for a while, so everyone better roll out the red carpet. Harold just stood there, jaw dropped, thinking, what kind of welcome is this and what nightmare of public execution am I trapped in? His head was spinning because the idea of that extra long visit suddenly felt way bigger and way more dangerous. As he absorbed the news, Erica flashed him a soft smile and thanked him for everything he'd done. Harold, still reeling, could only blurt out a stunned "what?" From the very start, he realized he had no escape. He'd been pulled into her orbit from the moment it began, and Erica only confirmed it with that knowing smile as she stared at him. Erica Sumeragi stands there, calm as still water, clutching a letter with a sharp, thoughtful stare, while the title asterisk "My Death Flag Doesn't Stop" asterisk teases the chaos about to break loose. The story bursts into the Grand Samurai estate, dripping with old-world elegance, and a fresh message snaps the air: Harold's letter has finally arrived. Inside the estate, Suku Sumergi, the family's head, sits across from Kuryu, her trusted servant, and leans in, grilling him for his take on the letter that just arrived. "You're gonna hold that letter and stare back with a dead serious look, saying it smells fishy, because if Harold is openly spilling info like this, there's gotta be a hidden agenda lurking behind it." Suku nods along with Kuryu's take. No matter what the letter gets wrong, the Stokes family has absolutely nothing to win by sending it. Then the truth hits. This letter's real message spells out the Stokes family's downfall, and Harold plus his parents are shown under a gloomy, almost ghostly glow. Tasuku thinks it over and decides Harold is just a messenger, but Kuryu refuses that idea. He points at how polished the letter is and knows Harold couldn't have written it, which means someone else is steering the whole game. Susuku chews on it, then finally snaps to the real question: who wrote that letter in the first place? Kuryu presses further, saying anyone who truly wanted to help the Sumeragi family wouldn't hide behind shady, roundabout tactics, and then he turns the knife. Does Susuku think someone's out there trying to hurt the Stokes family? Suku can't shake the feeling that Harold is being played with, maybe even put under a hypnotic spell, and he wonders if this is just a cruel little test of the Sumeragi family. Listen, he shuts that down and says if the Sumeragi family just stays patient and waits, then with their current mess, they'll hit their goals eventually, no stress. And then he presses the real question: is the danger of trying even worth the payoff? He weighed the consequences in his head and realized something chilling. If the real author of that letter wanted to dodge the predicted disaster, this mess was way more tangled than anyone could see. His face went grim, and he said there was a real chance the letter's contents were true. Asuku listened closely, then snapped orders into him: "Get the supplies ready, only the ones who still choose to step forward after hearing every risk will use them." Kuryu nodded, steel in his resolve. Miles away, a towering mansion dominated the horizon, its massive walls shouting that the Stokes family had ruled there for generations. Inside, a lavish feast already waited, then a warm voice practically urged the guest, "Take it all, no hesitation." Harold's father, the head of the household, threw open the doors and welcomed everyone with a booming grin, saying every dish was made from the finest ingredients grown in the Stokes territory, and then practically begged them to dig in and enjoy every single bite. Harold sat there with a quiet frown while Erica, always so polite, answered Yuno's question, and Yuno lit up like a kid, declaring the food looked absolutely delicious. Harold's mother clocked his strange silence right away and asked if anything was wrong, but Harold snapped back that it was nothing, just nothing at all. She reached up and brushed her hand across his forehead, checking for a fever, and then said he looked perfectly fine, while Harold, blushing hard, begged inside his head for her to stop putting him on display in front of their guests. Both his father and mother burst into laughter, and his dad teased that Harold had always been a quiet, shy kid. Still giggling, his mom playfully apologized and said it was downright awkward to get spoiled by his mother right in front of his fiancée. Harold, still getting tenderly grilled by his parents, clenched his teeth and wondered why only he was the one losing face, while they were the ones parading affection in front of guests, and that somehow felt backwards to him. Erica watched from nearby with a tight frown, and a servant hovered close by. Harold fumed in discomfort as Erica kept staring at him, and Yuno looked like she was watching too. Harold's thoughts spiraled, screaming that everything here was downright humiliating and he couldn't stand it anymore. He wanted out right now. After dinner, Erica stood with her back to Yuno, who was busy prying open a suitcase, and Yuno couldn't stop thinking. She'd heard Harold was the kind of rebellious kid who never followed the rules. Erica then dropped the bombshell that her father had warned her Harold could be tied to a traitor or worse, getting pulled around by them, because honestly his personality didn't scream easy to control, and after she tried to put him through tests herself, nothing solid ever turned up. She figured that unless they forced Harold to spell out his real intentions, they'd never shut down the danger he was bringing to the Summaries family. You leaned in and listened to Erica's worries, and the moment you saw her face, that thoughtful look said everything. She nodded along with Erica's take and made it crystal clear, this exact reason was why she showed up. You reassured Erica not to worry, snapping with confidence that secret investigations were her bread and butter as a detective, yet Erica pushed back, telling you to be careful, her face still soaked in concern. Harold was totally oblivious to the drama brewing somewhere else, fast asleep in his bed, while the day's chaos melted away into the silence of night. Meanwhile, after prepping for her job, she quietly slipped through and cracked open the door, ready to start uncovering the truth. She leaned by the window, staring into the starry night, and one name, Harold Stokes, kept burning in her mind. His behavior stayed maddeningly unclear. Was that calm just a mask, and did he really have ties to a traitor? If so, yesterday should have triggered something huge by now. This whole reasoning shoved me right back to that earlier directive for Erica: go poke Harold during the day while he's stuck at work, he can't step in. But her efforts didn't land, not even a little. Now the chilling thought hits harder: what if Harold isn't even aware? What if some invisible hand is pulling his strings? Tasuku Sumarji claimed he might not be choosing his actions at all, that someone could hypnotize him and take the wheel, yet that only raises one terrifying question: can that even be real? That tangled maze of possibilities meant her investigation would demand serious muscle, so she clutched a small, sharp knife, eyes locked in, ready to fight. Elsewhere, a man with slick, light-colored hair laid out the brutal truth: nobles treated every non-noble like they were nothing but tools, and he warned them that if they slipped up or fell short, the whole world would laugh them to pieces. His words landed like truth, right as a woman with a neat bun griped that taxes were snatching away most of their profits, and a pigtail girl beside her just nodded along, realizing it was squeezing tons of citizens into a frugal, tight-living life. With spiky light hair and a hard, stern stare, the young man warned that anyone trying to spark a riot would be walking straight into death, and then he dropped the real truth. The Stokes territory had been pouring all its money into the military, so its people were left with almost nothing. Down the street, a young woman with reddish-brown hair wrapped up her tail and said sorry she couldn't share more, but a little girl, who'd been hanging on every word, grinned and waved it off, admitting she was the one who'd asked about the town. Moments later, the young woman confronted a young man and confirmed that something terrible had struck Harold Sama. Then he raised the fresh problem surrounding Harold Sama right after. He leaned close and whispered a secret that made her eyes go wide with shock. She wondered if it was all some kind of mistake because she hadn't seen it herself, and he just shrugged like, I don't know for sure. Even with her doubts clawing at her, she had to admit it. Since the Stokes family's son was tied to it, the rumors suddenly felt real, and she'd heard the whole thing from folks who'd come to the estate. Two boys and one girl tore through a cramped street at full speed. Then a door slammed shut behind them with a brutal thud, and in the blink of an eye someone hammered boards across it, locking the place tight. As the kids bolted away, two silhouettes, one young man, one young woman, stayed planted in the street, framed against the night while she looked visibly shaken, and the townsfolk at the edges just stared, faces impossible to read. The young man and woman pushed on, their footsteps drumming a steady rhythm across the cobblestones. They finally screeched to a stop and stared at a far-off building, and the young man blurted out whether it was the store Norman had talked about, while the young woman beside him stayed completely silent. As soon as he stepped into the shop, the bearded shopkeeper lit up. He recognized Harold Sama instantly and welcomed him like an old friend, but Harold barely heard a word because his mind was racing. The Stokes territory wasn't even on the field map, showing up only in certain conversations or event scenes. Harold then told the shopkeeper to hand the young woman with him the right item, swearing he'd send someone back later to collect the payment. Surprised, the shopkeeper still nodded and agreed. A young woman snatched the item, murmured a small thank you, and Harold couldn't shake the feeling that behind that polite smile, she was seething with a spectacular hatred for him. He told himself she'd brushed off the rumors about him killing Clara, but now she was zeroing in on something, his face deep in thought. While others were busy, Colette, right there in her own thoughts, kept replaying everything she'd heard from the soldiers. Servants were whispering about an incident. She stared at the danger and worried about Clara and herself, then grimly clocked the real problem. If Harold's parents got involved, it could ignite a whole mess. Worse, she still hadn't cooked up a single solid plan to shut it down. Right there on the street, Harold felt the moment snap into place and blurted, "That's enough, let's go home." The young woman only nodded, whispering, "Yes." A young woman with long reddish-brown hair tied with a dark bow stood in still silence, eyes drifting off into the distance like she was deep in her own thoughts. Under a crystal-clear sky, the building's grand facade loomed, and a voice demanded updates on the growth. Inside, Harold Stokes sat at the table with two subordinates, leaning in as one of them reported that all 6 locations were growing strong and the harvest was right on schedule. Then Harold crossed his arms and demanded they expand the operation fast. But his female subordinate, Woman C, warned that pushing expansion any further would drain their manpower, while his male subordinate, Man A, shot back that if they skipped proper inspections, they'd run straight into farmers who only cared about themselves. Harold, face set in stone, snapped, "Is there really nobody else on this estate we can use?" Then insisted, "I'm not the one who's causing the manpower shortage, I can't fix it." Man A laid it out straight. Sending the current staff to the farm was a total mismatch with their regular duties, so he said Arius and Sexton could inspect, but right now it'd be rough to pull anyone else, and then Harold started asking whether they should just bring in outsiders. While Harold was mulling over outside hires, Man cut in and urged him to tell Harold's father he needed tight, close aides. Then Harold pivoted and demanded they talk about the soil instead. The Woman C stepped up and laid out her report on the experimental fields, confirming they'd seen 0 effect from the life potions so far. Then she counted the designated rotation, 6 times for the bell potatoes and 11 times for the Bruna. Harold leaned in, hand on his chin, and nodded as the chefs kept tasting the produce, but every time they swore nothing tasted any different. He decided the report wasn't a disaster, but it still wasn't rock solid. There hadn't been enough testing to call the results good. He ordered them to keep growing samples and track every improvement. Then just like that, the scene cut to outside the building, signaling the meeting was over. A young woman with reddish-brown hair sat across from a girl with long dark hair and white streaks, and you noticed she'd come back way too early. Her face stayed unreadable as she just stared right back at you. The The girl admitted the stares from the servants the night before weren't in her head and she felt it was pity because she was Harold's fiancée. But no, he shot back, that kind of hatred isn't normal, since even the citizens barely backed the Stokes family and she definitely hadn't expected that cold silence to spread so far. Uno kept talking, saying once you start digging into one clue, it almost always summons 10 or 20 more, and the girl nodded along, confirming that Uno's investigation was running like clockwork. Then the girl leaned in and asked what story had hooked Uno's curiosity. Uno froze for a beat, staring off like she was seeing it again, and finally admitted that yeah, there was one. Then Uno dropped a chilling truth. Apparently Harold Sama had used dark magic to torch a servant and wipe her whole family out to ash. As Uno spoke, a shadowy figure wrapped in brutal black flames slithered into the background and the girl went rigid, gasping with eyes stretched wide in pure shock. The girl fired back on the spot, doubting the claim and hinting it could be mere slander. Then you calmly named the murdered woman as Clara along with her daughter Colette San, still just 9 years old. You didn't spell out anything else, but you flat out said every servant gave her the same testimony, and the rumor suddenly didn't sound made up. Her face twisted in terror, and one word burst from her mouth, that's. Then she couldn't stop thinking about Harold, how he once dangled a slim ray of hope to save Sumaraga's people, only for that truth to wreck her. Because the same man seemed to hate her and spit insults at anyone he called weak. That inner turmoil hit hard. She couldn't stop asking herself if Harold Sama really was different, if the cruel picture painted around him was just a lie, because for a split second she pictured him standing there with Lord and Lady Stokes. Even as she wrestled with those thoughts, despair crashed over her because it hit her hard. He truly was different, nothing like his parents. She bowed her head, hands clenched in panic. She pushed on, saying she'd keep trying to spy on Harold, but Erica had to stay away from him because you can never really predict what kind of danger he'll unleash when you're alone. Erica's face fell as she swallowed her worries and quietly nodded, confirming she understood Uno's warning. Seeing Erica break down, you softly rested a comforting hand on her shoulder, telling her everything would be okay, and that you'd be there for her no matter what. Uno's eyes sharpened in an instant, and a steel-level determination snapped into place on her face. Erica stared up with wide, shaky eyes, echoing the idea like she could talk herself into believing everything would actually be fine. Meanwhile, Harold Stokes stood there like he owned the moment, chin up and eyes blazing, insisting, dead serious, that everything would be fine, like he could bend fate with his words. Later, in a calmer beat, Uno leaned in and asked Erica about the gift Harold had handed her, and it turned out to be a whole bag of frosted cookies dressed up with an adorable squirrel design. Harold Stokes planted his feet and clutched his sword, while crackling lightning energy surged from his body, warning everyone that a monster of power was about to break loose. Meanwhile, 2 whole weeks had already slammed by since Harold's last outing, while a woman with reddish-brown hair pressed the worry into the air, saying Sumaregi's daughter still hadn't bounced back since that day. The young girl's summoned daughter stood at the window, staring out with a heavy, hollow look, her long dark hair cutting across her face as the curtains fluttered softly beside her. Way outside the city's chaos, a huge open landscape rolled beneath a cloudy sky, with shadowy hills and thick forests fading into the distance. It was out here in this quiet wilderness that Harold kept hammering his training, stopping only to gulp air and shake off the strain, and he couldn't help but think. Choosing this forest for his special regimen right after the Clara rescue was the smartest move because with all that open space nobody could stumble in and interrupt him. He flashed a grin, suddenly seeing how this isolation set him free. No limits, no fear, so he swung his blade like a storm, then slammed his sword down with raw fury, and the impact ripped the air open with a brutal shockwave. Every one of his movements snapped with speed and precision. Each blade swing screamed through the air, blasting out a wave of energy that ripped straight through. With a sharp battle cry, Harold tore loose his unstoppable move, Swift Lightning, and a blinding surge of electricity exploded from his sword, blasting the ground like thunder. Lightning tore through the ground like a storm, shattering earth and flinging debris and energy blasts in every direction. And right in the middle of the chaos, Harold stood unshaken, sword locked tight, eyes blazing with resolve. Even after that brutal display of power, Harold let out a heavy sigh, rubbed his temple, and muttered that the technique still wasn't strong enough to be truly worth using. He stared at his lightning-fast technique, feeling its raw power, but it still didn't come close to the original Harold in that game, and it absolutely had to. Knowing how strong that one person in this world really was, he couldn't accept his own level anymore. Meanwhile, a woman watched him from behind a thick tree, her eyes widening as a blinding flash tore out from his training. She gulped hard, a cold shiver snapping down her spine when she realized she'd just witnessed something terrifying. Then she stared as he swung a sword that could have swallowed him whole, somehow moving with effortless ease, blending sword strikes with magic like it was nothing. And she couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding some unbelievable secrets. Still hidden, she couldn't shake how unsettling it felt because she knew she'd never get the real answer about whether he was a risk to them unless she faced him head-on. She kept spiraling over the danger, because if she faced him and he let loose that kind of power, she might not make it out alive even if she tried to escape, so she chose the smart move. Slip away, come back later, knowing her hidden weapons probably wouldn't stand a chance, and that this fight was too unpredictable to gamble on right now. As she tried to back away, a sudden, eerie silence ripped through the forest. Then Harold's blade came flying, perfectly reading her position and sinking into a tree right beside her. He slammed the moment into action, demanding to know who was hiding and shouting for them to step out. She froze the moment she was caught, heart pounding, thoughts snapping through her head as she tried to figure out her next move, bolt right now or stay put. Harold watched her like a hawk, and the moment she reacted to his moves, he knew she'd probably already clocked him. He couldn't shake the idea that if he had power like this even at 10 years old, she would have seen through what he really was long ago. She realized there was no dodging this with lies now, especially after he had hurled that sword straight at her. Harold's panic detonated inside his head as he insisted to himself that the sword only slipped from his grip by sheer accident. He stayed in the clearing, eyes blazing as they tracked every tree around him, waiting for his hidden watcher to finally show up. Yet after everything he shouted, not a single soul stepped out. A sudden, razor-sharp sound ripped through the woods and he jerked back in pure alarm because that earlier move had to have hit the watcher hard. The thought slammed into him, maybe they were hurt so badly they couldn't move. Panic burst open in his chest, and now he didn't know what he was supposed to do next. Right then, a young woman slipped out from behind the tree, dipped her head and shot him a heartfelt apology for spying, claiming it was only a sudden impulse. He froze, and that tiny flash of recognition lit up his face as he spoke her name, you know. He watched her like a hawk, and when he saw she was totally fine, relief hit him hard, yet he still couldn't shake the weird thought of why anyone would be excited to see a kid practicing with a sword. He finally turned to face her and barked that she'd better stop skulking in the shadows, because if she didn't know her place, he might accidentally hurt her again, and next time could be worse, way worse. Seeing her all sheepish, her look said it all, she quietly apologized. She weighed every word, and a subtle smile tugged at her lips as she silently understood. This wasn't advice, it was a straight-up warning. She realized his message loud and clear: mess up again and there'd be no second chance if she trespassed once more. Then he stood right in front of her, face set like stone, sealing her understanding of the warning. Yino spotted the sword still humming in the tree, just like proof of what he'd done earlier, and he realized he'd clocked her the whole time while she hunted for him, then handled it cleanly without hurting a single thing. He stood there in silence, replaying that showdown in his head, and the truth about what he could really do hit him like a punch. Then he couldn't help wondering if he could honestly protect Erika-sama when someone could crush him so easily. With a hard, unshakable stare, he declared to himself that he had more than enough power and brains to pull it off. A woman with long reddish-brown hair stared into the mess and whispered to herself that this wasn't something even a puppet could pull off, because deep down she knew it was an outright loss for her. She then shifted to Harold, clocking that Erika-sama still looked worn down, like the new surroundings were messing with her head, while he brushed her worries off with a lazy hunk and pressed on, asking about the sheltered girl. He flashed a smirk and basically told her, if you're that bothered then just scamper back home, and in his mind it was obvious, she wasn't broken, she was homesick. She blinked in shock at his icy attitude, reminded him that Erika was still his fiancée, and begged him to treat her better. So he snapped back that if he could be kinder, he wouldn't be dealing with this mess, then doubled down that their relationship was temporary and he wasn't about to let anything bind him, calling the whole idea idiotic. He instantly regretted every word, worried he'd just spilled too much, because there was no reason anyone should know he was even thinking about calling off the engagement yet. Meanwhile, she stared at him, eyes full of questions, and demanded to know what he meant. He shot back that he owed her no explanation at all, and his voice cracked higher with pure frustration. Even after the harsh words left his mouth, his mind kept snapping back to Erica, because this just not feeling well had dragged on way too long, and he could have sworn her constitution wasn't the type to buckle so easily. The woman with the reddish-brown hair kept staring at her reflection, looking deep in thought. She couldn't shake the feeling that this whole mess was a warning sign, one of those turning point moments, the kind that screams omen. Meanwhile, Erica, dark hair with bright white streaks, stood at the window, staring out with a deep, pensive look like her mind had vanished into another world. Erica stood with her back to everyone, her long dark hair spilling over her shoulders, those sharp white streaks glowing, while a delicate flower sat in her hair like a quiet promise. Her traditional kimono, woven with intricate patterns, caught the light as she stood perfectly still, eyes scanning like she was either deep in thought or silently soaking up everything around her. Meanwhile, Harold Stokes snapped to the fact that his sword was still stuck out in the forest, then cursed himself for being careless, because he had to grab it before darkness swallowed everything, especially since Yuno wasn't going to help him one bit, and just as he geared up to bolt, his eyes locked onto Erica. He watched her closely, worry flashing across his face as he wondered, did she finally recover, and was it really safe for her to be out and moving around? Harold weighed every terrifying outcome and knew one collapse on that exposed walkway would be disastrous, so he swallowed his fear and decided the only thing left was to talk her into heading back to her room. He strode up to her, biting words cutting through the air as he demanded why she was out when he'd heard she'd finally been doing better, until his temper snapped and he slammed her with idiot for wandering around, telling her to go straight home, even though part of him was raging because he couldn't bring himself to ask the simple, "Are you okay?" without turning it into something colder than he meant. Fed up with her stubborn silence, Harold leaned in and pushed her to talk, demanding to know why she wouldn't say a word, yet Erica only stared at the ground, giving him nothing. He thought about walking away, convinced she'd cool off and march back to her room on her own, then realized that at their age it's almost impossible to speak the truth when someone you don't like is still right there, so yeah, her silence told him his efforts were pointless. With a dismissive humph, Harold spun away and snapped that he barely cared whether her condition got worse. Just as Harold was ready to leave, he stopped dead, glanced back at her and softly told her to wait. Harold had just caught up to Erica and now he had a burning question ready to fire, while Erica had her own bombshell to drop. Her face turned stone cold as she dropped the rumor she'd heard, he'd used magic to turn a servant into ashes. He locked eyes with her, kept his stare razor sharp and grilled her on the spot. Was the rumor really true? He paused, that little smirk curling on his lips, and with a dismissive tone he shot back, "So it's that, huh?" Erica's expression softened for a split second, then she snapped back fast, "That's not true," and launched into her explanation. He cut her off mid-sentence, his smile stretching into something sinister as he bragged that he'd killed a servant, and her daughter too, then said it wouldn't matter much if they never got remembered in some heroic tale. She flinched back, demanding to know why he'd do something like that, and he shrugged it off, no real reason at all, just that they'd been grinding on his nerves. Erica, clearly breaking down, shouted that she'd had enough and begged him to stop, yet he kept going, spitting that they were basically livestock and it was his call whether to spare or slaughter them for fun. Then he even bragged that he killed the daughter out of mercy so she wouldn't be alone, insisting they were probably grateful because freedom meant nothing to his inferior kind. Erica's chest tightened as his cruel words hit her, and she stumbled back with her arms thrust out to shove him away, tears flooding her eyes. She stared him down, her face twisting with pure pain and disgust as she blurted that he was the worst human she'd ever met. Then he just glanced away like his expression meant nothing. She lit up with pleasure over his confession, then snapped that she had nothing else to say to him, so he scoffed back, sneering, "What do your words even matter?" Tears swarmed her eyes, flashing pure heartbreak and disgust at how his cold callousness had crushed her. And instead of answering, he just tore his eyes away. "Excuse me," bursting out of his mouth like a blade, treating her pain like it was nothing but an inconvenience. After that final, brutal put-down, she spun away from him and strode off from the bleak spot, heading straight for the grand Stokes mansion looming in the distance. He stayed put, lifted his fingers to his own face, and wore a quiet, unreadable look as she walked away. Inside the mansion, a grand, gold-drenched hallway stretched out for miles, lined with sparkling paintings and blazing sconces, pulling you deeper into the estate's heart. Moments later, Zin, still young, still buzzing with excitement, rushed down the corridor with a grin so bright it lit the place, yelling as if the next second couldn't come fast enough. As Harold stepped into the room, he waved like crazy, then bowed his voice and shouted, "Harold," with pure respect. Then he strode up to Harold and asked, "So you train too?" Harold nodded and said, "I just wrapped my own duties. I came to hang out with you." Harold wasn't having any of it. He snapped at Zen, grilled him for what was going on, and then shoved him out of his room, barking that Harold wanted to be left alone all day long. Zen was stunned and tried to ask why, but Harold cut him off like, "No questions, no buts." He stared in shock as the door slammed shut with a brutal crash, and there, kneeling on the floor, was a younger him, staring into the silence, completely alone. He stood in that endless hallway, tiny against those towering doors, while a distant voice echoed toward him, calling his name. Moments later, he crumpled against the shut door, a heavy sigh tearing out of him, his small body weighed down by something you couldn't see. Now older and razor-sharp, reflection carried a silent storm inside, his past memories crushing down on him, heavy and undeniable. He couldn't shake Erica's tear-streaked face, every shred of her anguish traced right back to what he'd done. He admitted it. Even though he meant to push her away, the non-stop verbal abuse he kept throwing landed like a sledgehammer, and now he could barely stand the brutal impact it left on his own heart. Still, a cold, iron resolve locked into his face. He snapped himself back, refusing to flinch or let his own brutal words shake him. He stared out at that massive estate, and grim thoughts roared in his head. If he couldn't even get through this brutal kind of hardship, then how in the world could he keep chasing the path he'd chosen? As the day kicked off, Erica and Harold split into their own worlds. Erica clung to a firm, unshakable resolve, while Harold just stared into the distance, chewing on something far deeper. He jolted awake with a groan, blinking at the floor beside a towering clock, and the blazing morning light meant he'd run out of time, too late for his death. He sat up in bed, staring at the way the day had vanished past noon, and one sharp thought hit him: maybe that slap from before left a nasty mark. He kept mulling it over, admitting that yeah, a game lover might eat up a wild Erica moment like that, but right now none of it felt exciting to him at all. He stayed sprawled in bed, a tiny, chibi-ish kid shape, still trying to wrap his head around everything after that late awakening. Then his mind snapped back to the basics of the day, and he decided to march straight into the dining room, because a sandwich was waiting there on a fancy, beautifully decorated plate. As soon as Harold stepped into the dining room, he was mid-bite when a butler, clean-cut, glasses on, mustache sharp, marched in and politely asked him face to face if he had been. Then the butler grilled him about waking up so late, worried he'd been run ragged, while Harold, small and visibly fed up, just listened through it all. He waved off the butler's worry, insisting he was fine and only couldn't sleep. Then he snapped the talk back to the LP farming method, pointing out their earlier plan to recruit fresh faces from outside. The butler made it crystal clear Harold was here for exactly that, then leaned in and fired the question, "So, did you come up with a brilliant plan to pull this off?" He fired off more questions to the butler, pushing for who they could recruit next, then demanded they prove the LP farming method to merchants and lock in contracts for the rights. The butler nodded, saying it would totally work to go hunting for merchants. Then the talk snapped to how the LP farming scheme would actually run. Merchants would buy the method, flip it to the farmers, and make the farmers cough up contract fees. Then the money gets sliced straight down the middle, 50-50 between the inventor and the merchants. Harold didn't beat around the bush, he was seriously worried. If they wanted the farmers inspected properly, they couldn't just hope for talent to magically appear, they'd need a big, proven company to lock in the right people. The butler nodded and admitted they couldn't trust any company to count on, and Harold said he was already collecting both the butler's and Jake's takes on it. He went on to spell it out: independent merchants were scarce, and with no connections, a sudden pitch to some company would vanish without a trace. Harold leaned in, eyes sharp like he was already plotting the next move. Harold wondered if his parents had connections, but the truth hit him fast. There was no way they'd just accept the LP farming method on the spot and see its full power without the right backstory. In the end, he pushed them to stay on their current path and tell Jake the plan, while the butler agreed that grabbing merchants was smart, but warned that the real fight would be finding ones they could actually trust. Suddenly, a sharp knock slammed through the silent halls, and a voice called out for Harold. The knocking wouldn't stop, pounding harder and harder while that young man's voice cut through the door. "Harold-sama, are you here?" He leaned in and stared into the room, and the moment he clocked that Harold wasn't there, worry snapped across his face. He burst into the grand hall, hunting for Harold, but the moment his eyes landed, he found Erika-sama sprawled on a lavish couch instead. He said hello, and in the back of his mind he figured Harold was probably training again, because of course he was, even with how early the day had started for him. Erika shot back her greeting, then told Zen that Yunasan had slipped out of town for something personal, so Zen introduced himself and asked straight up why she wasn't with him today. Stunned that Uno was nowhere to be seen, Zen blurted out to Erika, "Why are you here?" And Erika shot back, "Are you here for Harold-sama?" Then added, "Because Harold doesn't look like he's around right now." He shot a quick gasp, convinced Harold would be right there in the nearby room. Haruka noticed Harold-sama hasn't stopped running around lately, and Zen warned him not to push himself too hard, so when she saw Harold's worried face, she leaned in and demanded to know what was wrong. She leaned in just a bit, eyes locked on him, and demanded to know if he was really clueless about what was going on. He stammered, fighting to ask what she meant, then Erika leaned in and dropped the grim rumor. Harold-sama had used magic to murder a servant. His eyes flickered wide when he caught wind of those rumors, but he shot back fast that he couldn't confirm whether any of it was actually true. He went on, saying he wouldn't dare treat them as facts while the proof still refused to tip either way. Erika cut right through his doubt and said Harold-sama himself had confirmed the rumors, then leaned in and asked, "Since the one who got killed was right here in this house as a servant, wouldn't he know it was true?" Then only managed a strangled sound of disbelief. Erika couldn't stop shaking after that bombshell. How could she possibly like Harold, and how could anyone follow him after the alleged murder? She admitted she was struggling hard to accept it, saying she just didn't know how, and Zen watched her in stunned silence. Then he snapped at her, "Erika-sama, how could you ever forgive Harold after he took a life?" And you could practically see the storm inside her as she repeated the question, torn apart by the fact that her heart couldn't make peace with what he'd done. She stared at her life as Harold's fiancée and felt the weight of her duty. Saving her people came first, but it still hurt knowing those personal feelings could trip her up at the worst possible moment. Tears brimmed in Erika's eyes as she blurted out to Zin that forgiving Harold was the only thought haunting her, no matter what anyone said, and she even apologized sincerely for letting that messy emotion spill out, her hurt plain as day. With one last soft apology, she spun away and Zen was left staring, stuck on every word she just left behind. He watched her walk away, and his face twisted into pure worry and deep thought. As Erika strode off with her back to the observer, one burning question hung in the air. Is this really okay? The narration then clocked the scary part. This girl looked just like Harold. You've got Erika trying to choke down her real feelings just to keep the Sumaragi family standing, while Harold-sama carries the stain of murderer, even though he risked everything to save a woman and her child. Even with all their huge similarities, the narration still wondered if it was really okay for these two to split up and keep living with that constant fight between them. Zen stared the truth in the face and knew this couldn't go on like this. Because if Erika and Harold truly shared the same strength and kindness, then they had to open up, lean on each other, and finally walk side by side. Zen stepped up to Erika wearing pure honesty on his face and asked her to come with him. She met his eyes, surprise flickering there, then answered with a hesitant, yes. He couldn't help but think it through, quietly apologizing to Harold in his head, bracing for the brutal road ahead. His thoughts kept roaring in his head and a terrifying truth crawled up inside him. Harold could one day split apart, shattered beyond repair. He clenched his fist, refusing to let that horror ever happen. His mind wouldn't let go of the fallout. He knew that if he tore his eyes away right now, everything would spiral out of control. He was terrified he'd lose Harold to some brutal fate, and he knew it would haunt him forever because he couldn't melt away the thorns ripping straight through Harold's heart. Zen's resolve snapped into steel. He'd never forgive himself for not trying to save Harold, and his steady gaze burned with pure, unshakable determination. Then he spun to Erika and told her straight up. He didn't care if she left him behind as long as he could help her in some way. Even when he admitted he felt useless, Erika leaned in and listened with her back to him. He shot to her side and begged for just a second, swearing something vital was about to be said, then started explaining that Harold was exactly who she couldn't afford to ignore, watching Eric's eyes blow wide with shock. Erika thought for a second, nodded and agreed, then leaned in and asked, "So where are we going?" With a bright, wide grin, he gestured to a spot beside him, practically begging her to come closer. Erika froze in surprise, then a warm little smile flickered across her face as she joined him. Zen and Erika face a towering, double-doored entrance and Erika glances back at him, demanding to know where they're headed. Zen just tells her to step in and brush off the fact that they haven't been given permission. Then he whips around to her with a confident grin and declares like it's obvious, "We're in Harold Sama's room." Her eyes snap wide with shock and pure disbelief floods her face like a wave. Zen clutched the package and grinned so bright it practically lit the room, while Harold and the butler hovered nearby, poring over those papers together. Zin suddenly shot off in a blur, blurted out an apology, begged them to wait, leaving Harold staring in total confusion at his wild, sudden exit. Moments later, Harold yanked open the door, bam, and Zen was staring back, yelling in shock with his hands up, ready to raise the alarm. He tried to calm Harold down, but Harold shot him a furious glare, like irritation was written all over his face. Inside the room, Clara, still hiding, finally clocked that her escape plan had totally failed. She'd been caught sneaking a peek into Harold's room, and now she was trapped, panicking over her next move, while outside Sin stared at the mystery, wondering why Harold would lock away his guest in a place like that. Zin stormed back to Harold, swore he had something crucial to say, and Harold shut him down with a sharp, "Make it quick." Clara's name had been dragged through every corner of the town, and he finally spilled the truth. Just moments earlier, while he was shopping, shopkeepers and customers bombarded him with non-stop questions about her. He kept pressing the alarm, warning that Harold's reputation would crash hard if they didn't move now, insisting he hadn't said a word himself, yet knowing a disaster was already looming. Harold lounged on the couch and let out a heavy sigh. His reputation had been slipping for ages, and Zen's words hit exactly like he expected. Harold just shrugged, questioned why those rumors even mattered, and the whole time the rest of them stared in disbelief. He fires off a hard, stern interrogation at Zen, demanding to know if Zen really wants everyone to know that Clara and Colette escaped the Blouish village alive and in one piece. Zen froze in pure shock, then shot the idea down with fierce certainty. He'd never say that, not even if it meant dying for it, while Clara knelt nearby, eyes wide with worry, watching him like he might break. Harold, already sitting down, waved Zen off and said, "If my parents even suspect we're alive, they'll get suspicious, so I've already made my final choice to wipe out that risk completely. Don't waste your mind on pointless questions." But Zen wouldn't let it go, pushing back, "So why can't we at least tell Erika?" He kept his face locked serious, but inside he could tell Clara was crushed by the rumors swirling around her. Claire's face twisted with real distress as their refusal kept coming, then Harold stared him down and barked, "Absolutely not." Then he snapped at Zen, demanding to know why he'd even question his choice. Zen blinked, looked confused and a little fed up and just shrugged back, "Why not?" Clara's face burned with pain as she swore she'd never tell him the real reason behind her. Because if she did, the death flag would snap into place, and Erika would end up hating her all over again like in the original story. Zen's face tightened as he realized Harold's kindness was a lifeline, but that same goodness could drag him straight into his own downfall right here, right now. Harold watched Clara and snapped. She'd been crying, and he shot off a fast, believable excuse, then warned Zen not to tell Erika or else face severe consequences. Zen just blurted back with a shocked F. Clara kept crying, convinced that in the end her tears were just pity for someone else, like she was an idiot for it, while Harold watched, wondering if her sobs were for the person he'd killed, or if she was mourning the mother and daughter he'd wiped out. He couldn't shake the thought that if someone as kind as that walked beside him, it would only end in endless pain, because he saw their kindness as a weakness, just pity from someone who couldn't do anything more. He kept going, insisting his choices weren't only for her, they were for both of them, because there was no way he'd ever marry some girl who cried at every little thing. While Harold talked, Zin watched and asked if Harold was pushing Erika away on purpose, scared she'd get hurt. Clara leaned in and listened, totally locked on. Zen listened to Harold's words, then carefully asked, "So you're saying you don't plan to marry Erika?" Harold looked him dead in the eye and said it straight. This engagement wasn't love at all, just a deal bought with money, so obvious even a simpleton could get it. A few years back, a brutal miasma suddenly swept through the Sumeragi territory's forest, smashing their forestry industry overnight and throwing the whole continent into an unheard-of catastrophe. While countries and feudal lords stalled and wouldn't part with a single coin, driving the Sumeragi family to the brink. But the Stokes family, craving that bloodline, was ready to step in with help. Harold snapped back to the present and told Zen straight up that if the Sumeragi family's downfall over that broken engagement was what kept him up at night, he'd already laid the groundwork to stop it. He broke it down, saying that when he headed into Sumeragi territory to meet them, he had Erica deliver a letter meant for Tessu. Zin and Clara both froze in shock, firing off questions about that letter the moment it was mentioned. Harold kept going, telling them that in the letter he laid out a plan to manufacture an antibody strong enough to cut through the miasma, plus a prediction of how the pollution would spread so they could brace themselves. Then he said he'd pitch the LP farming technique too, but admitted he'd left the engagement deliberately vague, promising he'd share industrial know-how even though it still hadn't been tested enough. He figured that with the antibody in hand and the LP farming method, the Sumeragi family could coast for now. Then if they wiped out the miasma problem and rebuilt their forestry business, they'd be fine even without his family's help, so that broken engagement wouldn't crush them that badly. Clara stared at him, and a bright blush spread across her face. Clara kept replaying every sharp detail of Harold's master plan in her head as Zen nodded and said, "Got it." Then he pressed Harold hard, asking if he really pulled it all off, even the antibody and that letter all the way through. Harold just answered in the broadest, most noncommittal way. He smirked like a quiet finally in his eyes, because Zen had nailed the real point of everything he'd been trying to say. Zen still had questions clawing at his mind, so he pressed Harold for answers, until Harold snapped his finger and shoved the talk sideways, warning them to look at their own grim future too. He spelled it out again, his old warnings about the Stokes family's crash under crushing taxes and reckless spending weren't going away. He flat out said he wouldn't play mediator for them and told them to brace for unemployment unless they changed their ways. Zen, worried about the people, pushed back. Couldn't the LP farming method stop this collapse before it starts? Harold waved off Zen's worry with a cryptic smirk, basically saying Tasuku Sumeragi wouldn't let anything truly catastrophic happen. Clara's eyes widened as Harold's words finally hit, and the realization crashed over her like a wave. Zen, still reeling from the name Tasuku, cornered Harold and demanded the full story. Harold then leaned in and admitted Tasuku was tied to the royal family and would act as their liaison, pushing for them whenever he could, and he even confessed he'd written to the Sumerages begging them to treat their citizens fairly. Because if the Stokes family ever fell, otherwise he'd be stuck mocking his own people for failing to survive. His face hardened as he barked a ruthless warning: if this information ever slipped out, they'd be buried before they even saw daylight again. And with that, he slammed the lid on his tangled little story. Clara fell silent, lost in deep thought, while Zen, finally relieved, fully aware of how serious this was, rushed to Harold and promised he'd understood everything and wouldn't breathe a word to anyone. He said he wanted to stay, but Harold, cold and dismissive, cut him off and told him to hurry out and leave if that was all he had to say. Undeterred, he pressed Harold for his plans and then slipped in his own secret passion for swordsmanship, hoping to watch Harold train, until Harold snapped that the sudden question was just plain irritating. Just as Harold was getting his thoughts together, Clara suddenly popped up and insisted on watching him practice his sword, and Harold couldn't believe it. Harold froze mid-breath, wrestling with one brutal truth: if he wanted his lightning strikes to hit clean every time, he had to grind swing practice until his accuracy sharpened. He then agreed to show off his swordsmanship as a special privilege, and Zen's excitement lit up plain as day. Harold snatched up 2 swords and Zen immediately demanded, "Why do you need both?" Because Harold had to confess he had 0 experience sparring. Harold flashed a chilling grin and waved off Zen's fears, barking that all Zen could do was keep moving as much as possible, because death was coming either way, then made it painfully clear he planned to turn Zen into a live target. Zen jolted with terror, finally seeing the brutal truth. Harold slammed him with a stern look, ignoring his indecent begging and shutting him down, no backtalk. Clara leaned behind a half-open door, eyes locked on the chaos as it played out in front of her. She stood alone, face a locked mystery, while Harold's brutal training hits finally landed in her bones. She froze in the doorway, eyes far away, staring like she'd just lost the world, and the whole room seemed to hush while she took everything in. A voice, or maybe her own thoughts, startled over what that discovery really meant. Clara and Colette truly made it out safely to Blowish Village and they're still alive, so the question hits hard: should she shout this to everyone? Her wooden sandals tapped softly on the ground as she planted her foot forward, each click like a spark igniting her resolve. She stepped out into the open air and worry flickered across her face as she scanned the surroundings. Inside, Yuno shouted asking who was there, and Erica greeted Clara warmly the moment she came back. Eyes blazing with urgency, Clara clutched her chest and insisted she had to verify something right now. Erica stared at her, worry etched all over her face. Harold wrestles with what happens if his parents learn Clara and Colette are alive, because he knows that could make him look guilty, so he insists he's acting for more than just Clara, he's doing it for both of them. Then he pushes the plan forward. He wants the Summaries family to survive even if he isn't there to help once they can get their forestry industry back on its feet. Meanwhile, Clara is pressed with one brutal question. Does she really want him to stand in public and announce that she and Colette escaped to Block Village and that they're still alive? Clara sprints like something chasing her while Harold, sword in hand, watches with a thin, smug smile, thinking that if their engagement crumbled it wouldn't even matter here. Zen and the butler just stand back and stare. Years later, Clara and Erica sit side by side, replaying everything like it's fresh. And Clara says that if their theory is right, then the origin of those antibiotics suddenly clicks into place. Erica nods and adds that the moment antibiotics were developed lines up even perfectly with this new truth. Erica couldn't believe it. There was no way a drug this complicated could be built in just a few days, and even with the Sumeragi family throwing everything they had into hunting clinical samples, they sadly came up empty. Clara leans in and says Harold probably saw the Sumeragi family's crisis coming years ahead, so far ahead that she's left wondering if he clocked it long before their engagement was even on the table. A fist clenches tight and the weight of it hits him. Harold really did cook up a drug to help the Sumeragi family, even though he had no business getting tangled with them at all, and the worst part is, he stood to gain absolutely nothing by stepping in. Erica can't help but believe Harold poured his soul into this, because that tiny glimpse of him hunched over a desk working nonstop screams just how brutal the effort really was. Erica, sword now strapped to her back, can't stop thinking Harold was the kind of person who caught spying the second it happened, no matter how quiet you were, and that feeling won't let go. Something is terribly off, so what if it's actually possible for him to miss someone hiding inside his own room? Clara sat there lost in thought, wondering if Harold meant to go after Erica and what dark reason was driving him. Erica, still stuck in her thoughts, can't shake the feeling that Harold's help is a setup, like he's plotting to poke her again, and that there's something darker behind his kindness. As she kept replaying Harold's puzzling behavior in her head, she couldn't shake how terrifying he felt, like she'd never truly understand him, and the longer she analyzed his every move, the more suspicious he became in her eyes. Meanwhile, Harold zoned out and let out this heavy, drawn-out sigh, thinking back 3 whole weeks since that slap landed and the sting still wouldn't let go. He told himself there was nothing to worry about, but with his hands tied and no company search going anywhere, doubt still crawled in. Meanwhile, Erica and Clara stuck together, and Erica kept muttering when those two would finally call it a night, since it had already been about a month since they moved in. Harold stood there in his room when a knock slammed the door. Then a young voice, Norman, asked if Harold Sama was around, and after a beat, Harold gave the go-ahead for him to come in. Norman told Harold that the master had summoned him, and Harold just stared back in shock. Harold soon found himself standing before the Stokes family head, who wasted no time. He said Lady Erica hadn't been doing well lately, then added that at Yuno's request he was ordering Erica back to the Sumeragi territory. The Stokes family head leaned in and spilled the next move. He told Harold he'd be escorting Lady Erica. Harold's grin stretched wide, almost thrilled, and he practically breathed out, saying he finally wouldn't have to look at her ever again. Watching it all, the Stokes family head just shook his head and muttered that Harold was still just as shy as always. Just when Harold finally exhaled, the Stokes family head dropped a jaw-dropping decree and crushed his relief. Harold was ordered to stay at the Sumeragi residence for a while to forge a deeper bond with them, and his eyes went wide with pure disbelief. Still stuck on that brutal surprise command, Harold stammered, freaking out over why he was being forced to do something like that. The Stokes family patriarch, unshakable as stone, snapped Harold's attention and reminded him that Lady Erica is the Sumeragi family's treasured daughter. Then he pressed him, straight as her fiancé, to prove his sincerity, win her over and move in close with the woman who'll be his wife. Harold stood there shaking, crushed by how impossible the task suddenly felt. He doubted the Stokes family head's real intentions, convinced that the order was just a shiny cover-up to prove he and Erica were getting along. He called the situation dire because even under normal circumstances he wanted nothing to do with Erica. Now it felt like getting shoved into a minefield while Erica stood right there, staring with an expression he couldn't read. A fresh thought hit him like lightning. His whole plan to pitch the LP farming method to Tasuku depended on selling it to a company in Stokes territory and running more trials, so now he had to wonder, was this awkward closeness with Tasuku the surprise chance he needed to spread it? Meanwhile, Zin watched everything unfold and knew one thing: Harold's plans were starting to look bleak, especially if the Sumeragi family got pulled into this. Harold chose his move and felt it could finally click, because the best card he needed to turn Tasuku into an ally was already on the table. So he decided to gamble on Tasuku's raw sympathy, and the butler who'd overheard it all started hustling, getting everything ready for their immediate departure. With a smug little smirk, Harold brushed off the Stokes family head as a fool, and the man, totally clueless about Harold's real thoughts, just happily gushed about how close Harold and Erica had gotten like he hadn't noticed a thing. The story swept into the quiet heart of the countryside, revealing the Bloesh village tucked among rolling hills and thick green forests. In Bloesh village, a traveler stepped up to a villager and asked, politely but with purpose, if he could ask a question, and the villager, eyes bright with curiosity, immediately agreed to hear him out. The traveler, a young guy flashing a friendly grin, leaned in and admitted he'd been hunting for a woman named Clara Meller. Young Harold stood there with a serious stare as the story flipped to a brand new chapter called Spies. Far from the chaos of the big cities, a quiet countryside sprawled out, soft hills, peaceful fields, and little humble homes scattered everywhere. In this calm little world, Clara flew through her chores, humming as she pinned the freshly washed clothes to dry, and with a sharp crack she snapped that huge sheet out like a flag. Now she beamed, thrilled the laundry was finally done, while far off a tiny figure was still out there playing. As she stood there, a cool breeze swept past, and her eyes drifted across the endless open land, turning her calm thoughts into a deep, wondering stare. She stared at how fast time had slammed forward, 5 whole months since that pivotal moment, and somehow it still didn't feel real, like it was all just a dream. Her mind snapped back to that doomed day, when Harold was just a kid and the feudal lord was set to execute him and erase him from the world. And Zen stood there as a young man with a calm, twisted smile while Clara watched the grim execution unfold before her eyes. Harold, the boy who stepped in to help, was barely a year younger than her own daughter, and that detail still hit her hard. Clara snapped at herself for those intrusive thoughts, but she couldn't stop wondering where Harold had disappeared to and what he'd been doing ever since. She figured out that if anyone ever found out she was real, it'd drag trouble straight onto Harold. So the Stokes family wasn't something she could touch anymore, and she understood the ban. Right then, Yuno slid up to her, all smiles for a brand new morning, greeting Clara. Leona greeted her with a cheery good morning, then shot, "Did you see me around?" And Claire just laughed, saying she already knew the answer. Leona's smile faded as she admitted it was true. She'd already headed to the ranch with Colette to buy milk. Leona apologized for Liner running errands so often, then smiled and said he always hauled their milk back, no harm at all, because this boy was trying to join the chivalric order and he had to build his body for it. Clara nodded with a warm smile, and as Leona waved goodbye, Leona teased her to keep working hard on the lines from here on out. All of it sank in. Now she was alone, eyeing those cookies she'd baked the day before, waiting in tense hope for Liner and Colette to come back. While she was lost in thought, a hooded stranger slid up and demanded, "Are you Clara Meller?" She answered yes, but the caution in her voice gave her away. With a steel-straight stare, the man promised he'd cut right to the chase, then leaned in and asked if she knew anything about the boy named Harold Stokes. When Claire heard that, her eyes instantly widened in shock. He kept going. People in Stokes' territory were whispering that that boy had murdered a servant, and then he pressed Clara to say what she really thought about those rumors, freezing her on the spot. She clenched her fist and refused to let the grim rumors be the whole story, her mind racing toward something better. Even with Clara clearly breaking inside, the cloaked man stayed ice calm and promised he'd come back again. So Clara, still shaken, snapped that she knew nothing and told him firmly to leave. Her mind got swallowed by a terrifying vision, and if the feudal lord really caught on, Harold was doomed. Her thoughts flashed to the Stokes family head, all shadowy and still, waiting to cut Harold down with a sword. Her desperate plea sliced through the silence, a burning prayer to the heavens begging someone higher to step in. Her silent prayer kept burning, one desperate plea for Harold's protection, like she could ward off that looming threat if she just begged hard enough. Meanwhile, at a towering grand estate, Tasuku, light blonde hair and all, stepped out to greet the arriving crew, flashing a warm welcome to Erika and Yuno as they stood side by side with Norma. Then he shifted his focus to Harold and greeted him warmly too. After promising everyone they'd be escorted to their rooms soon and pushing them to finally rest from that brutal journey, Tasuku turned and called straight out to Harold, speaking directly to him. Harold cut him off cold, said he had something urgent to talk about, and ordered Tasuku to clear time in his schedule later. Tasuku kept his cool and politely suggested they meet tomorrow evening, saying he couldn't make it tonight because work had him slammed, while Harold fumed inside but still nodded and agreed. Even though Harold nodded on the outside, his mind kept screaming about Tasaku's unshakable calm because the guy was just as steady as the story said. Then the whole group turned and started walking off. Far away, Clara stood still, eyes locked on something only she could see, lost in deep, quiet thought. You watched Yuno step up to Tsuku and she instantly noticed you, eyes locking as he asked what she needed. Then he faced her head-on, waiting for her answer. Then she shoved a document into his hands, explaining it held a full report on what's going on in Stokes territory, along with her findings about Harold. He took the report, praised her hard work, and said he'd read it later, and then she stood there with a quiet, pensive look as he walked away. She stared back at everything that had slipped by since that fateful day, and the truth hit hard. No matter how hard she pushed, she still hadn't found even one real lead. Her mind raced back to every time she tried to dig for answers, and how those 3 servants kept slipping away from her, Zin babbling through rushed excuses, the butler smiling politely while dodging every question about his clothes, and the Stokes family head brushing her off with pure dismissiveness. She figured Harold had to be controlling the information like a razor, even as she admitted to herself she'd squeezed a little more out of Zin than anyone else. Her investigation even drifted into the agriculture world, where private investigators swore an inspector kept showing up again and again, but they still couldn't figure out what he was really up to. She realized they needed to dig deeper. Those tight-knit groups of independent farmers were so close that getting in unnoticed would be brutal. Just as she was lost in thought, a voice snapped through the air calling her name, Sama, from behind her, so she knew she couldn't keep asking questions right then. She spun around and saw drop under her seeker, and when he finally caught his breath, he teased her about how fast she'd come back, then shrugged and called it a coincidence. After that, he leaned in and asked her if she'd actually found the one she was hunting. He confirmed that Clara Amalier was really in Blosh village, and you could hear the shock in his voice when he asked whether he'd somehow failed to meet her face-to-face. He confirmed he'd made contact, but she shut down every question about the incident's truth. Still, she clearly knew Harold, and when that sunk in, her face went thoughtful. Then it hit Yuno like a lightning bolt. She finally realized this was it, the only choice left for them. Once Yuno made up her mind, she snapped that she'd have to go see the woman herself, and the cloaked man just stared, silent, but fully watching her determination harden into action. Harold took a slow sip of his green tea, eyes narrowed as he clocked Tsuka's late arrival, then his mind raced back to the LP farming method, because it was first created to stop the Stokes family's decline. He couldn't stop thinking about what would happen if the Sumeragi family, staying neutral the whole time, ever got wind of this method, because they'd snatch the chance like it was destiny. Harold knew Ryunur would wipe out the miasma in a year, but until then he needed Tasuku in his corner. If Tasuku helped, they could back Ryunur and the others from the shadows, dodge those terrifying death flags way easier, and that's why he sent Tasuku the letter, because taking a road the game never showed was worth the gamble. Harold told the Stokes family head that the LP farming method couldn't be copied perfectly from the game, so they had to churn out even more prototypes before Tasaku could buy in. Even with how far they've come, he keeps driving the point home, their tech still has to level up big time. Harold laid it all out. If they didn't push the improvements, they'd never be able to spread LP farming, no matter how hard they tried. He said things were predictable up to now, but labor shortages were choking the work, and that slowdown would stop them from snagging Tasuka's all-important cooperation. With a jolt, it hit him. If he wanted to dodge that death flag hanging overhead, he'd have to talk about this right now. Harold clutched the document like it was a lifeline and swore he'd deliver this crucial information no matter what. He showed up and found Tasuku right away, and before Harold could even speak, Tasuku was begging for forgiveness for the delay. His work had run long. Harold clocked how slammed Tasuku was, but he also had to admit it was way better now thanks to the antibiotic he'd made. Then he ordered Tasuku to lift his head, saying loud and clear that he didn't act just to be thanked, yet Tasuku stayed genuinely grateful and offered his thanks all over again. He insisted he couldn't afford any other choice, saying that no matter what Harold meant, one thing was undeniable: the whole situation flipped for the better because of him. Harold brushed off Tsuku's gratitude like it meant nothing, snapped that a kid like him had no business kneeling to anyone, and tore into him for being too useless to do better, leaving Tsuku stunned and unable to speak. Then he couldn't stop smiling. He was thrilled to meet Harold, and in his eyes Harold's future was packed with bright expectations. Harold flashed a small grin at Tasuku and told him, "Then wag your tail and fall in line." Tsuku snapped at Harold for showing up so suddenly, wondering if that was why he'd been hauled in at all. No hello, no warning. Harold brushed the question aside and snapped that he wouldn't waste time playing that guess your hands game, then ordered Tasuku to read the documents first. He sifted through the documents that laid out the LP farming method, then showed off prototype farm results powered by life potions, leaving Tasuku staring, trying to crack what the whole LP farming method really meant. Tsuku's eyes widened as he drank in the document, and that comparison graph hit like a punch. These products could double the harvest compared to old-school farming. He glanced up and bam, Harold was staring him down, smirk curling across his lips like he already knew exactly how he'd react. Harold slammed his point home, swearing the claims were the real deal, and Tasuku, still stunned, could barely believe what he was hearing. Harold pressed him again, demanding he just say he didn't believe it. Tasuku froze at the bluntness, wondering if Harold had counted on that exact skepticism all along. Even with his doubts gnawing at him, Tasuku insisted that the nerve behind those claims made him crave the whole story, because tossing something this wild aside, especially when it came from the man who saved the Sumaragi family with his antibiotics, would be downright stupid. Harold stayed calm and flat out told them, "Hear his proposal, whether it's true or a lie, and it won't cost you a single thing." Tasuku took one look at that and instantly understood. Just knowing he had access to a document like this was a huge win for him, so he nodded and agreed to listen. Harold then thrust a copy of the document into his hands, shrugging it off like it was nothing but a plain duplicate. As Harold took a sip, Tasuku stared him down, reading every twitch while Yuno's report echoed in his head. Harold wasn't being puppeted by some outside force, his moves were powered by his own will, and that level of manipulation was considered impossible. Harold kept downing drinks like nothing mattered, while Tasuku wrestled with his own next move. Because if he killed the negotiation right here with a fake look of disbelief, he could still run the LP farming method off the manuscript and take 0 losses. He studied Harold's calm, calculated act, then slid the document over like it was just another casual offer. Harold's offer, handing him the initiative and letting the negotiations begin, sat like a crushing weight on Tasuka's mind, because he could feel something bigger hiding behind the gesture. He couldn't shake the feeling this was just Harold's warm-up, an opening move before the real bombshell he was about to drop. He couldn't walk away from this negotiation now. Doing so would be suicide, he decided, and the reason felt terrifyingly clear. Maybe Harold was letting the Sumaragi try the LP farming method to see if it really worked, or maybe the method had a fatal flaw baked into it from the start. No matter which truth it was, Tasuku slammed his fist shut, eyes locked on the future, determined to stop any chance of harm reaching the Sumaragi. With fresh purpose burning in his chest, he leaned in and zeroed on Harold's main proposal, determined to uncover his real motives down to the last detail. He then told Harold he'd take his offer, making it clear the deal couldn't move an inch without their cooperation, so Harold just nodded right along. Still stuck on Harold's earlier words, Asuku demanded answers, and Harold, arms crossed, shot back a question, telling him to give his opinion like the document's contents were 100% real. Suku said that once they rolled out his plan and the harvest shot up without a hitch, they could finally lock in a powerful production system across their territory, his groundbreaking invention. Then he promised that the moment they seized real market dominance, he'd unleash the method and let it spread all the way through the whole country. Harold's eyes went razor-sharp as he grilled Tasuku, demanding to know if he'd really refuse to hog the method. Tasuku dug in his heels and said straight up that hoarding those resources for a handful of people would spark brutal fights later on, because chasing quick profits like that would leave them drowning in enemies. He said it was fine to make money off LP farming, but getting treated like the enemy by everyone around him was just plain annoying. And with a sly smirk tugging at Harold's lips, he announced that Tasuku had finally passed his test. After Tasuku's plan got the green light, he leaned in and dropped the real reason for the meeting: "I'm here to make you a proposal." Tasuku shut out everything else, eyes locked on him, dying to hear what he'd say. Then he announced that Tasuku would become the joint developer of LP farming, handing him a huge role that would shape the methods ahead, and Tasuku just stood there, taking it all in like it suddenly got heavier. Harold sat there like he owned the moment, sipping tea from a dainty cup. Then he looked up, irritation flickering across his face, and snapped that Tasuku was late. He replayed the whole LP farming plan in his head, the tech he'd cooked up from game knowledge from day one, and remembered how it was first rolled out to help slow the Stokes family's slide. He sized up the Sumarajai family crashing into an economic crisis, and knew they'd be desperate to snatch up his cutting-edge method. Then he pictured the future 8 years from now, when the miasma would finally be crushed by the protagonist's Liner and his crew. He'd even written to Tasuku for one reason. Getting a line with him right now would let him back Liner from the shadows, dodging any nasty flags before they could blow up. He told Saku straight up that the game's LP farming method couldn't be copied word for word in real life, so he'd have to run even more trials before he could sell it. He couldn't shake the fear that if he brought up a glitchy tech problem, Tasuku would immediately think he was full of nonsense. He realized that without Tasuka's crucial backing, he couldn't spread the LP farming method far and wide, and he'd be stuck waiting until the original story kicked off 8 years later. Sure, everything had gone right so far, but now he was short on the right people, and that bottleneck was grinding production to a crawl. With this massive obstacle bearing down on him, he decided he had only one move left. Right now, he'd march straight to Tasuku and lay down a direct proposal. He clutched the document tight, eyes locked on the prize, and swore he'd fight tooth and nail to win this massive wager and bring that reward home. He burst into the room with a breathless apology, admitting his work kept him stuck for longer than he wanted. Tasuku watched him closely and still caught that something looked off. Harold didn't deny it. He just explained that the antibiotics Tasuku had pushed him to take finally turned the tide, and now he was doing much better. Tasuku then snapped at him to lift his head, calling his bowed posture an ugly sight, and said his help wasn't meant for the kind of losers who beg for pity. Yet even with those brutal words ringing in the air, Harold stayed in a respectful bow and still poured out his heartfelt thanks, dead serious about his gratitude. Harold declared loud and certain that Tasuku's intervention flipped everything for the better, no question about it. Asuka scoffed at Harold's words, calling his sentiment idiotic, then told him he should be ashamed for bowing to some kid. While Harold fumed inside, he just shot back that he had nothing to say. Then Tasuku suddenly switched gears, his voice brightening with pure, absolute delight at finally meeting someone so promising. Harold gave a tiny grin and asked, "So it's really true?" Then leaned in and said, "If Tasuku's happy, wag your tail like a dog and let's get you working alongside." Shocked by Harold's blunt push for an audience, Tasuku couldn't stop wondering, was he already skipping straight to business, and was this really the whole reason Harold wanted him? Harold made it crystal clear he wasn't trying to butter anyone up, he just wanted Tasuku to read the document sitting on the table between them. Tasuku snatched up the document and read the title **LP Farming Method**, then dove in, where the pages spilled the trial results for crops brewed with the healing medicine everyone called **Life Potion**. His eyes bulged the moment he spotted that harvest comparison graph, every crop's yield shot to several times what traditional cultivation could ever pull off. Suzuku's stunned silence got met by Harold's cocky, mischievous smirk, and behind him a second young guy just stood there with arms crossed, watching everything like he was waiting for the next move. He inched his hand forward, palms settling on the table, and when he finally spoke, he admitted the data was real, only it was so shocking it practically stunned him. Harold jumped in, demanding to know why he wouldn't just admit it was unbelievable. Then Tasuku shot back, asking if Harold expected him to think it was suspicious. Then it hit him, those results were so wild they demanded answers, and the terrifying part was this: he couldn't just brush Harold off. because Harold was the very man who'd handed over the manufacturing method for the antibiotic that saved the Sumeragi territory. Harold felt the war inside him flare up, then blurted out that no matter what was true, he should still be allowed to ask questions. He gave in and admitted it plainly. Just having the data on the table was already raking in huge profits for Harold. Harold then pulled out a manuscript and shoved it into Tasuku's hands like, "Take it, it's nothing but a manuscript, honestly." So when Harold took a sip and the moment his mind sprinted, I realized it, Harold wasn't anyone's puppet at all. He was a real person thinking and choosing for himself just like Yoho's report promised. And the scary part? You can't twist someone that completely with just lessons or brainwashing. Talking to him proved it. He kept going in his head, thinking that if he admitted his shock during the discussion and pointed to the manuscript, the Sumeragi family would rake in the benefits for free, just like Harold said earlier. If you want it, you can have it, it's just the manuscript after all. Still, even with Harold acting generous, he knew the real move. Harold was handing the opening right to him, daring him to speak first. He stared at Harold's moves, asking himself if that LP farming method manuscript was just a warm-up, or the spark before something far bigger. He knew stepping back right now could be deadly, or that his own plan might hide a nasty flaw, so he decided to stop any threat to the Sumeragi clan before it could strike. With pure grit, he steeled himself to hear Harold out and find out, for real, what Harold was trying to pull. He then told Harold, "I'll hear you out, but only if you speak your request. If you don't say it, this conversation can't move forward," and Harold just nodded like, "Got it." Harold crossed his arms and dared him, "So what's a loser like you gonna do with this data, huh?" As if the contents were nothing but pure truth. Tasuku said that if his method worked cleanly, he'd launch production in his territory, then crush his way into every corner of the country once he'd taken control, while Harold couldn't hide it. This was a truly groundbreaking invention. Harold stared him down like, "So you'll actually leave it alone, won't you?" Hasuku declared that he wouldn't play that game, because if you chase quick profit and start grabbing without thinking, you don't just spark trouble, you forge enemies, and soon the few who hoard all the wealth will drag everyone into war. Harold smirked and basically agreed with him, then took one more jab at Tasuku as a loser before nodding and saying, "Very good, you passed." Harold then finally dropped the truth. This was exactly why he'd come with that proposal in hand, and that Tsuku, still stone-faced, told him to speak without holding back. Tasuku just stared as Harold flashed that confident smirk and vowed he'd make Tasuku, joint developer of the LP farming method, right after Tasuku had already judged him wrong. Harold stood outside a classic shop, brow knit with thought as he watched the busy street roar around him. The story cuts to this calm outdoor spot, where a traditional building's ornate roofline shoots into the sky like a perfect silhouette. Moments later, Harold slipped into a warm, soothing bath and felt his whole body wake up again, like pure bliss had wrapped him in comfort. He looked back at his recent wins, amazed at how seamlessly he'd teamed up with Tasuku and how fast they'd lined him up with a sparring partner. He couldn't quit smiling because everything was clicking perfectly. As he finally exhaled, he spotted delicate sakura petals drifting through the water, and the whole sight felt weirdly beautiful. Later, when night finally rolled in, that massive old traditional building loomed under the moonlight like a secret waiting to be uncovered. Inside the room, Tasuku, Erika, her father, and Yuno crowded together, and Tasuku leaned in, demanding to know if Yuno had anything she needed to report. She confirmed it, saying she'd been digging into Harold-sama for ages, all while following Erika-sama's orders. Then Erika's father just murmured like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Erika cut in with a quick apology to her father for running spies without permission, then insisted there was one thing she had to confirm, so her curious father leaned in and asked what it was. Her father finally admitted that rumors were flying through the Stokes territory, and when Erika pushed harder, she demanded to know if he'd heard the one about Harold-sama murdering a servant and the servant's child. Her father leaned in, grilling her about whether she was claiming the parent and child were still alive, and she nodded, saying the idea that the rumors might be total lies had started to take shape. She went on, saying she'd called in Yuno and her crew to confirm the truth, and guess what? The rumors everyone was buzzing about were totally wrong. Then her father leaned over and pushed Yuno to explain everything. So yeah, when he finally turned to the whole gathered family, he straight up revealed that the parent and child were living right now in Blosh village, a tiny settlement ruled by a different noble. She also said the mother never changed her name, so anyone could track them down just by asking the local villagers, and Yauno even admitted she went to confront the woman herself, but the woman refused to talk about what happened back then. Then the story zeroed in on Yuno as she reached a modest little home, rapped on the door and called out politely for Melosad. A second later, the door creaked open just a crack, and a woman leaned out cautiously, demanding, "Who's there?" There, before anyone could react, she apologized for the unexpected drop-in, then introduced herself as a messenger from the Summaries family and said she had questions to ask. The moment she mentioned Harold Sama, everything clicked and the woman's face flashed with surprise. You know, she found out her subordinate was being rude the other day, and now she can't stop wondering, was that jerk really Harold in disguise? So then you're hit with it. Erika, the Sumeragi girl, and Harold Sama are already gearing up for their wedding. Amila's face tightened with worry as she admitted that even with everything in place, the Sumarai family was still clashing. People were raising objections and refusing to drop their suspicions that Harold Sama had something to do with the murder. She screamed through tears, her voice shaking with pure anguish as she revealed that Harold was in serious trouble. You know, Harold never bought those rumors, especially once Amila herself showed up alive and kicking. Confused out of her mind, Amila challenged the claim. Then she revealed the truth. Harold swallowed the stain of murderer and even pleaded guilty himself, so the citizens turned their backs on him with pure disdain. Outside, he kept up a normal smile, but inside, the weight of it quietly drained him dry. Yuno leaned in and insisted she had zero plans to spill the hidden truth to the public, yet she offered Amiler a way in. If Amiler was willing to share it, Yuno felt she could hunt down secret allies for Harold and begged her to help save him. Amiler's eyes instantly brimmed with tears. Meanwhile, a younger Harold stood stiff with a grave face, while his assistant and Tasuku watched him closely, like he was still haunted by the weight of an old burden. Choked with emotion, Meller crumpled to her knees and finally admitted her silence wasn't empty, it was meant for me. Yuno stepped in, softly took her hands, and admitted that Amila might be terrified to speak the truth, then promised she'd come ready for that exact moment. She swore she'd do anything to help Harold and Erika, even if it meant risking pain that could hit Amila. And when Amila stared up, Yuno wrapped her in a tight embrace and promised, loud and certain, that she could help. Amila, finally steady, waved Yuno in and said this was too big to talk about out there. With fresh determination blazing in her chest, Amila decided, if Harold was going to be protected, then she'd throw everything she had behind him too. The past finally cracked open. Erika was sentenced to be executed, and Harold Sama snapped into a cruel lie, claiming he'd test his magic on her, then threw her into a dungeon cell. It was all a slick cover-up to slip her out of Hayden Sama's grip after she accidentally injured him. Then he carved out a window to plan her escape, until the day came when he freed her and her daughter at last. It was like Harold Sama went above and beyond. He handed them a wagon, a home, all the household goods, and even paid for their relocation so their new life could finally begin. Harold Sama decided to swallow the blame for Erika's actions on purpose, so no one would ever connect her or her daughter with the escape, and they'd stay safe. That revelation clung to the air like a thunderstorm, and everyone leaned in, eyes locked. Just as Erika started to walk away, the old man snapped, calling after her and demanding to know where she thought she was headed. She blurted that she didn't know Harold's real intentions, didn't bother to dig deeper, and instead took her feelings out on him. Then guilt hit hard, and she knew she had to rush to Harold Soma and apologize. Still, she knew he might never forgive her, but her heart wouldn't let her quit. She had to try. The older man slammed his stance and swore she wasn't going anywhere. She kept her mouth shut while her father laid it all out. Harold's truth had to stay locked up because he was paying a huge price just to protect them. Then he warned her that if Harold ever found out they'd spilled details, he'd clamp down even harder, turning colder and more suspicious than before, and her father finally admitted that it was only natural for her to feel like she had to apologize. She wondered what to do if she couldn't fix her mistake. Should she bow her head and apologize anyway? Then her father pushed back hard, asking straight up if her apology was just meant to make herself feel better or if she truly wanted to set things right. His hand settled softly on her head, like comfort wrapped in guidance. He told her she could become Harold Sama's supporter, and if she really wanted to atone for what she'd done, she shouldn't beg for forgiveness. She should chase him, get closer, and prove it. Then he muttered that Harold, for all his brilliance, might be so sharp it pushes people away, because even strength can make him lonely. With his hand still resting on her head, Erika replayed his words, "Get close to him." Her father kept pushing, begging her to watch Harold's every move, step closer to his world and become the one person who finally understands him. He went on to say that Harold's brilliance meant he needed allies, not friends, and then he hit you with the question, would hooking up with him even be that easy? Erica leaned in, eyes locked on her dad, and when he said, "I'm sure even for you, Harold's fiancé, this road won't be easy," her expression went pure tension. He told her that even if she gave her whole heart to Harold, he might still never truly open up to her. He stared her down and demanded to know if she had the guts to believe in and follow a man like that. Erica said nothing, her face blank, eyes lost in deep thought. Her father finally gave in and admitted she still had to apologize for striking Harold, then told her not to answer his question on the spot. She could take her time, watch Harold up close, and decide what she wanted to do. She stood there in total silence, back turned to us, staring at the ancient Japanese architecture like it held answers she couldn't stop thinking about. Elsewhere, Yino gave a single, crushing yes, while Erica's father watched her like a hawk. Erica's father spun toward her and said Yuno looked crushed, like that first day the engagement was decided, then shrugged it off as just what kids do as they grow, and Erica snapped back, insisting he couldn't possibly mean that because they'd lived through this whole kid growing up thing before. He let out a quiet chuckle because he knew now that he had their beloved daughter, her feelings would hit even harder. Yuno stayed close, staring off like she was drowning in her own thoughts. While everyone stared ahead, a carriage rolled up at a whole different spot. Harold hopped out, and his assistant announced loud and clear that they'd arrived. As Harold and his assistant strolled through the grounds, Erica walked beside them and stared in awe at a massive, sprawling complex. This was the biggest martial arts temple in the Sumeragi territory, where kids and adults alike trained every single day in a mix of deadly arts like archery, sword fighting, and even magic. Harold whipped his head toward Erica, his face hard with seriousness, and demanded to know why she was there. His assistant cut in, saying, "I brought her because her opponent keeps demanding she show up." Harold nodded along even if he didn't fully get it and dropped the subject, while Erica stayed tight-lipped, staring off like she was somewhere far away. In a wide, echoing dojo, Harold, now dressed in full martial arts gear, stood poised and asked, straight up, if anyone had shown him how to wear it right, and his assistant nodded, said his opponent was already there, and introduced the young fighter, Itsuki. Itsuki, bamboo sword in hand, whipped around with a grin, and Harold, his assistant by his side, hurriedly tossed out an apology and mumbled about the return. As soon as Itsuki was introduced, he swept Erica into a tight hug, blurted her name like he'd been aching to say it, and couldn't stop praising how much more beautiful she'd become since the last time he saw her. She thrashed in his iron grip, begging him to let her go because she couldn't breathe, while he kept talking, checking whether she'd been eating right, showing off the souvenirs he'd prepared, and then cracking with loneliness, saying he hadn't gotten a proper night's sleep for days. Meanwhile, Harold watched that way-too-sweet display unfold, jabbed a finger at Itsuki, and demanded of Tasuku, "Is that really gonna be your opponent?" Tasuku stayed calm and said he got why Harold worried, but Itsuki's power was untouchable. Erica, still shaking off the hug, turned to Harold with a worried look and asked, "Are you okay?" With a stern look on his face, Harold snapped that the Suki was just a kid no matter how anyone tried to spin it, and he'd even asked to be paired with someone powerful. Tasuku just smirked and shot back, "So doesn't that same rule apply to you, Harold?" Calm but locked in, Itsuki stepped up to Harold and introduced himself, his voice formal, declaring he was Itsuki's samurai and the older brother of Erica. Harold's eyes popped open as the truth hit him. Suki was Erica's older brother, and then he stepped forward, straightening up to formally introduce himself as Harold Stokes. Suki's attitude snapped in an instant. She seized Harold's GI and yanked him closer, firing questions at him, then drilling straight into the one thing, was he Erica's fiancé? Harold froze at Itsuki's straight-up question, and pure shock hit him like a tidal wave. He then snapped into a wide, almost manic grin, and for some reason the whole mess felt absolutely wonderful. His smile stretched wider and wider as his mind got swallowed by one terrifying thought, his little sister's fiancé. Harold stared as his Suki kept up that way-too-familiar routine, clamping Erica's shoulders with such brutal intensity that she flinched. She begged him, voice low and shaky, to stop, clearly cringing at her brother's loud, over-the-top affection.